My name is Zephyr, and I grew up in Willowbrook, a small town nestled against the edge of Shadowmere Forest. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, but secrets still manage to fester behind closed doors. For my best friend Astria and me, those secrets were particularly dark and painful. We both came from homes where abuse was a daily reality. My father, a mean-spirited drunk with a motorcycle gang for friends, made our house a place of constant fear. Astria had it no better, living under the oppressive rule of her stepfather, a man whose public facade of respectability hid a monster. Shadowmere Forest became our sanctuary, a place where the troubles of home couldn't reach us. During the day, we'd explore every nook and cranny, building elaborate forts and imagining ourselves anywhere but Willowbrook. The townsfolk dismissed our forest excursions as typical childhood behavior, but for us, it was pure survival. I remember the day everything changed as if it were yesterday. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the air heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and the promise of winter. Astria and I were at our favorite spot near Shadowmere Lake, a vast body of water that always seemed to hold secrets beneath its placid surface. "Zephyr," Astria said, her voice barely above a whisper, "have you ever thought about just leaving? Running away from all of this?" I looked at her, noting the fading bruise on her cheek that her long auburn hair couldn't quite hide. "All the time," I admitted. "But where would we go?" She shrugged, absent-mindedly tracing patterns in the damp earth. "Anywhere but here. Maybe we could make it to Crystalline City, find jobs, start over." I nodded, but we both knew it was just a fantasy. We were only 16, with no money and nowhere to go. Shadowmere Forest was our escape, but it was also our gilded cage. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lake's surface, we reluctantly made our way back to our respective homes. Little did we know that this would be the last normal day we'd have for a long, long time. It was a Friday night when everything went to hell. My father had been on a bender for days, and I could hear the ominous rumble of motorcycles approaching our house. The gang was coming, and I knew what that meant. I retreated to my room, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of raucous laughter and breaking glass filled the house, and I could smell the acrid stench of cigarette smoke seeping under my door. I wedged my desk chair under the doorknob, a futile attempt at creating a barrier between me and the chaos outside. As the night wore on, I heard heavy footsteps approaching my room. The doorknob rattled, and a gruff voice called out, "Hey kid, come on out and join the party." I held my breath, praying they'd give up and go away. But the pounding on the door grew more insistent, and I could hear my father's slurred voice joining in. "Open up, you little shit!" In a moment of panic, I did the only thing I could think of. I dove into my hamper, burying myself under a pile of dirty laundry. The smell was awful, but it was better than facing what waited for me outside. I don't know how long I stayed there, curled up in that cramped space, my heart thundering in my ears. It felt like hours. Eventually, the noise outside my room died down, replaced by the sound of snoring and occasional mumbling. Carefully, I extracted myself from the hamper, every muscle aching from being in such an awkward position for so long. I crept to my window, which faced the backyard, and slowly pushed it open. The cool night air hit my face, and I took a deep breath, savoring the momentary feeling of freedom. Our backyard was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a distant streetlight. I could see the outlines of motorcycles parked haphazardly near the gate. With trembling hands, I climbed out the window, dropping silently onto the soft grass below. I made my way to the back fence, my heart in my throat with every step. As I reached the corner, I paused, listening for any sign that I'd been discovered. Hearing nothing but the distant hoot of an owl, I scrambled over the fence, scraping my hands and knees in the process. I landed with a soft thud in Old Man Thaddeus's backyard. The eccentric hermit was sitting on his back porch, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Our eyes met, and for a moment, I thought he might raise the alarm, but he just nodded slightly and looked away, pretending he hadn't seen me. It wasn't the first time he'd witnessed my escape, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. I ran through his yard and out onto the street, my bare feet slapping against the cold pavement. The 2 blocks to Astria's house felt like miles, but finally I arrived, out of breath and shaking. Her window was dark, but I tapped on it anyway, praying she'd hear me. After what felt like an eternity, the curtain twitched and Astria's face appeared. Her eyes widened when she saw me, and she quickly opened the window. "Zephyr, what happened?" she whispered, taking in my disheveled appearance. "Can I come in?" I asked, my voice cracking. She glanced over her shoulder, fear flashing across her face. "I can't. They're fighting again. If they catch you here..." I nodded, understanding all too well. "Then come with me. Please. I can't go back there tonight." Astria hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "Give me a second," she said, disappearing from the window. A few minutes later she emerged, wearing a hoodie and carrying a small backpack. We didn't speak as we made our way towards Shadowmere Forest, both of us too wrapped up in our own thoughts and fears. As we entered the forest, the canopy of leaves above us blocked out what little moonlight there was, plunging us into near-total darkness. We walked by memory, our feet finding the familiar path to Shadowmere Lake. When we reached our usual spot, Astria pulled out a small flashlight from her backpack, along with some snacks she'd managed to grab. We sat down on the damp grass, our backs against a large oak tree that overlooked the lake. "Want to talk about it?" Astria asked, offering me a slightly squashed granola bar. I shook my head, taking the bar with a grateful smile. "Not really. Just the usual shit, you know." She nodded, understanding without needing the details. We sat in companionable silence for a while, munching on our meager snacks and listening to the night sounds of the forest. "Do you ever wonder what's really in there?" Astria asked suddenly, gesturing towards the lake. I shrugged. "Fish, water plants, the usual lake stuff, I guess." "Yeah, but have you ever noticed how no one ever swims in it, or fishes? It's just... there." I had to admit she had a point. Shadowmere Lake had always been a part of the landscape, but I couldn't remember ever seeing anyone use it for recreation or anything else. As if on cue, we heard a strange sound coming from the water's edge. It was faint at first, almost like the lapping of waves against the shore. But there was no wind that night to disturb the lake's surface. "Did you hear that?" Astria whispered, her eyes wide. I nodded, straining my ears to catch the sound again. There it was, a soft scraping noise, like something being dragged across pebbles. "Maybe it's an animal," I suggested, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "A raccoon or something." But even as I said it, I knew it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. The noise was getting louder, more deliberate. It sounded almost human. Astria and I slowly got to our feet, our eyes fixed on the water's edge. The scraping sound was definitely coming closer, accompanied now by what sounded like labored breathing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and scared in the darkness. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" There was no response, just the continued sound of something dragging itself towards us. Astria's hand found mine, squeezing it tightly. And then we saw it. A pale hand emerged from the water, its fingers unnaturally long and bent at odd angles. It was followed by another hand, and then a head of long, dark hair that hung in wet, tangled clumps. Astria's flashlight beam caught the figure as it pulled itself from the lake, and I felt my blood turn to ice. It was a woman, or at least it had once been a woman. Her skin was a sickly shade of green-gray, bloated and waterlogged. She wore what might have once been a white dress, now torn and stained with lakeweeds and what looked horribly like blood. But it was her face that made my heart stop. Her eyes were milky white, unseeing and yet somehow fixed directly on us. Her mouth hung open, revealing blackened gums and teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. For a moment everything was still. The woman, the thing, perched at the water's edge, staring at us with those blind eyes. And then, with a speed that seemed impossible for something that looked so decayed, it launched itself towards us. Astria screamed, dropping the flashlight as we both turned and ran. I could hear it behind us, a wet slapping sound as its bare feet hit the forest floor. The stench of rotting flesh and stagnant water filled my nostrils, making me gag as we crashed through the underbrush. We ran without direction, our only thought to get away from the horror pursuing us. Branches whipped at our faces, roots threatened to trip us with every step, but we didn't slow down. The sound of our pursuer never faded, always right behind us, accompanied by a high-pitched keening that didn't sound like any noise a human throat should be able to make. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been minutes or hours, but eventually we burst out of the tree line, stumbling onto the street that bordered Shadowmere Forest. The sudden light from the street lamps was blinding after the darkness of the woods. Gasping for air, we turned to look back at the forest. There, just at the edge of the trees, stood the woman. She swayed slightly, her head tilted at an unnatural angle as she stared at us with those milky eyes. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish out of water. What is that thing?" Astria whispered, her voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to form words. As we watched, the woman took a step forward, then another. She was coming out of the woods. "Run!" I managed to croak out. "Run!" We took off down the street, our bare feet slapping against the pavement. I chanced a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The woman was running after us, but her movements were all wrong. Her limbs jerked and twitched, her head lolling from side to side as she gave chase. We reached the intersection at the end of the street, and without thinking, I pulled Astria towards my house. It was closer, and I knew my father and his friends would be passed out by now. As we neared my house, I risked another look back. The woman had stopped at the edge of the street, her figure illuminated by the harsh orange glow of a streetlight. She stood there, swaying slightly, her eyes fixed on us. We didn't stop to question our luck. We raced up to my house, and I quickly retrieved the spare key from its hiding spot under a loose brick. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door, and we tumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. The house was quiet, the only sound the muffled snoring coming from the living room. Astria and I leaned against the door, our chests heaving as we tried to catch our breath. What was that thing?" Astria whispered again, her eyes wide with fear. I shook my head, still unable to process what we'd just seen. "I don't know, but it couldn't have been real, right? Maybe someone was playing a sick joke on us." Even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. No costume or special effects could have created what we'd seen. The smell alone. We spent the rest of the night huddled in my room, the door locked and the chair wedged under the handle once again. Neither of us slept, jumping at every creak of the house settling or distant dog bark. As the first light of dawn began to filter through my window, Astria and I made a pact. We would never speak of what we'd seen to anyone. Who would believe us anyway? But we also swore that we would never go back to Shadowmere Lake at night. Never again. The days following our terrifying encounter at Shadowmere Lake passed in a haze of fear and paranoia. Astria and I went through the motions of our daily lives, attending Willowbrook High, doing our chores, trying to avoid the wrath of our respective tormentors, but everything felt different now. The world seemed darker, more dangerous, as if the veil between our normal reality and something much more sinister had been torn away. We tried to convince ourselves that what we'd seen that night had been a hallucination, a shared delusion brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But deep down, we both knew the truth. The woman from the lake had been real, and she was still out there somewhere. At school, we kept to ourselves even more than usual. Our classmates, who had always viewed us as the weird, quiet kids, now gave us an even wider berth. I caught snippets of whispered conversations in the hallways. "Did you see how pale they look?" I heard they were out in the forest all night. Maybe they're on that new designer drug from Crystalline City. Let them talk, I thought. They had no idea what was really out there. Astria and I spent our lunch periods huddled in a quiet corner of the library, poring over every book we could find on local legends and folklore. We were looking for anything that might explain what we'd seen, any story of a spectral woman haunting Shadowmere Lake. But we found nothing. As the days turned into weeks, the immediate terror of that night began to fade, replaced by a constant, low-level anxiety that never quite went away. We still avoided the forest at night, but during the day we found ourselves drawn back there, as if some invisible force was pulling us towards the lake. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a month after our encounter, Astria and I decided to revisit the spot where we'd seen the woman. We told ourselves it was to look for clues, to find some rational explanation for what had happened. But deep down, I think we both hoped to prove to ourselves that it had all been in our heads. As we approached the lake, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. We reached the shore where we'd been sitting that night and stopped, both of us hesitant to go any further. "Do you see anything?" Astria whispered, her eyes scanning the water's edge. I shook my head, relief and disappointment warring inside me. "Nothing. It looks normal." We stood there for a long moment, the only sound our own shallow breathing. Then, just as we were about to turn and leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, half submerged in the mud at the water's edge, was a tarnished locket. With trembling hands, I reached down and picked it up. It was old, the metal corroded by years in the water, but there was no mistaking what it was. A heart-shaped pendant on a delicate chain. Astria's sharp intake of breath told me she'd seen it too. "Zephyr," she said, her voice barely audible. "We need to tell someone." I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. But who could we tell? Who would believe us? The answer came to us both at the same time. Old Man Thaddeus. Thaddeus lived on the outskirts of Willowbrook, in a ramshackle house that looked like it might collapse in a strong wind. He was a local legend himself, known for his vast knowledge of the area's history and his collection of odd artifacts. Some people called him a witch, others a fraud, but everyone agreed that if anyone knew about strange occurrences in Shadowmere Forest, it would be him. We made our way to Thaddeus's house, the locket burning a hole in my pocket. As we approached the sagging porch, I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool autumn air. Astria raised her hand to knock, but before her knuckles could touch the weathered wood, the door creaked open. Thaddeus stood there, his rheumy eyes peering at us from beneath bushy white eyebrows. "I've been expecting you," he said, his voice like gravel. "Come in, children. We have much to discuss." Exchanging a nervous glance, Astria and I followed the old man into his house. The interior was cluttered with books, strange artifacts, and jars filled with things I couldn't and didn't want to identify. Thaddeus led us to a small sitting room and gestured for us to take a seat on a worn sofa. "You've seen her, haven't you?" he asked without preamble. "The Lady of Shadowmere." I felt the blood drain from my face. How did you know?" Thaddeus sighed, lowering himself into an armchair that creaked ominously under his weight. "Because you're not the first, and I fear you won't be the last. She's been haunting these woods for generations, but few live to tell the tale." With shaking hands, I pulled the locket from my pocket and held it out to him. "We found this today, by the lake." Thaddeus took the locket, turning it over in his gnarled hands. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment I thought I saw fear flicker across his weathered face. "You've drawn her attention," he said quietly, "and now I'm afraid she won't let you go easily." "Who is she?" Astria asked, her voice trembling. "What does she want?" Thaddeus leaned back in his chair, his eyes taking on a faraway look. "Her name was Isolde," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. She lived in Willowbrook over a century ago, when the town was little more than a logging camp on the edge of Shadowmere Forest. He paused, his gnarled fingers tracing the pattern on the locket. Isolde was beautiful, they say, with hair as dark as a raven's wing, and eyes the color of the lake on a stormy day. She was betrothed to the son of the lumber baron who owned half the forest, but her heart belonged to another, a young worker named Finn. Astria and I leaned forward, captivated despite our fear. Thaddeus continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Isolde and Finn would meet in secret by Shadowmere Lake, planning to run away together. But on the night they were to leave, Isolde's fiancé discovered their plan. In a rage, he confronted them at the lake. There was a struggle, and Isolde fell into the water. Thaddeus's eyes met mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. They say Finn tried to save her, but her dress was too heavy, dragging her down into the depths. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Isolde was gone, her body never found. But that's not the end of the story, is it? I asked, already knowing the answer. Thaddeus shook his head slowly. No, child, it's not. They say Isolde's spirit still haunts Shadowmere Lake, seeking vengeance against those who wronged her. Some nights, when the moon is full and the mist rises from the water, she emerges, searching for her lost love, or for new victims to drag into the depths with her. A heavy silence fell over the room as Thaddeus finished his tale. Astria's hand found mine, squeezing it tightly. But why us? She asked. We didn't do anything to her. Thaddeus's gaze fell to the locket in his hand. Perhaps you reminded her of what she lost. Or perhaps... He trailed off, his brow furrowing. Perhaps what? I prompted, my heart racing. The old man's eyes met mine, and I saw a mixture of fear and determination in them. Perhaps you're the ones who can finally put her spirit to rest. As if on cue, a gust of wind rattled the windows, making us all jump. Outside, the sun had set, plunging Willowbrook into darkness. And somewhere in that darkness I knew, the Lady of Shadowmere was waiting. Astria and I left Old Man Thaddeus's house that night with our heads spinning. The tale of Isolde and her tragic fate seemed too fantastical to be true, yet it explained so much about what we had witnessed at Shadowmere Lake. As we walked home through the darkening streets of Willowbrook, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. What do you think he meant? Astria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. About us being the ones to put her spirit to rest? I shook my head, feeling the weight of the locket in my pocket. Thaddeus had insisted we take it with us, saying it might be the key to unraveling the mystery. I don't know, but I'm not sure I want to find out. Maybe we should just forget about all of this. Astria stopped walking and turned to face me, her eyes blazing with a determination I hadn't seen in years. We can't, Zephyr. You know we can't. If what Thaddeus said is true, Isolde will keep haunting Shadowmere Lake, maybe even hurting people. We have to do something. I wanted to argue, to say that it wasn't our responsibility, that we were just kids trying to survive our own personal hells. But deep down, I knew she was right. We had been chosen for better or worse, and we couldn't turn our backs on this. Okay, I said finally. But where do we even start? Astria thought for a moment. The library. There must be records from that time, old newspapers, something that can corroborate Thaddeus's story. If we can find out more about Isolde, Finn, and what really happened that night, maybe we can figure out how to help her move on. I nodded, a plan starting to form in my mind. We should also try to find out more about the locket. Maybe it belonged to Isolde, or it could be connected to her in some way. As we continued walking, the streetlights flickered ominously. A cold breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of weeping. Astria and I exchanged a glance, picking up our pace. The next few days were a whirlwind of research and mounting anxiety. We spent every free moment in the Willowbrook Public Library, poring over microfiche of old newspapers and dusty town records. The librarian, Mrs. Pendlebrook, eyed us suspiciously, but didn't interfere with our investigations. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. We found articles about the logging camp that would eventually become Willowbrook, mentions of the wealthy Blackwood family that owned much of the surrounding forest, and even a few references to a scandal involving the youngest Blackwood son and a local girl. But it was an obituary from 1889 that sent chills down our spines. It read, "Tragic accident at Shadowmere Lake. Miss Isolde Crane, 18, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Edmund Crane, drowned yesterday evening in a boating accident on Shadowmere Lake. Miss Crane was to be married next month to Mr. Everett Blackwood, son of lumber baron Silas Blackwood. The community mourns this terrible loss." "This is it," Astria whispered, her finger tracing the faded print. "This has to be her." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of excitement and dread. But there's no mention of Finn, or any suspicion of foul play. It's like they just swept the whole thing under the rug. "Of course they did," Astria said bitterly. "The Blackwoods probably owned half the town. They wouldn't want a scandal tarnishing their name." As we continued our research, we discovered more unsettling details. There were reports of strange sightings around Shadowmere Lake in the years following Isolde's death. Loggers spoke of a woman in white wandering the shoreline, her cries echoing through the trees. Fishermen refused to cast their lines in the lake, claiming something in the water would tug at their boats on moonlit nights. But most disturbing of all were the disappearances. Every few years, someone would vanish near Shadowmere Lake, often young couples. The official reports always cited accidents or runaways, but the pattern was undeniable. One afternoon, as we were leaving the library, we quite literally ran into Callum Blackwood, a descendant of the original Blackwood family and one of the most popular boys in our school. Books and papers scattered across the sidewalk as we collided. "Watch where you're going, freaks," Callum sneered, brushing off his expensive jacket. Then his eyes fell on one of the newspaper printouts we'd been carrying. His face paled. "What are you doing with that?" Before I could stop her, Astria snatched up the paper. "Just a history project," she said coolly. "Fascinating stuff about your family's past, Callum. Lots of skeletons in that fancy closet of yours, huh?" Callum's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I'd be careful if I were you," he hissed. "Some secrets are better left buried. For your own good, stay away from Shadowmere Lake." As he stormed off, Astria and I exchanged a look. It was clear that the Blackwood family knew more than they were letting on. But how much did Callum know? And how far would he go to keep the family secrets hidden? That night, as I lay in bed trying to make sense of everything we'd learned, I heard a faint tapping at my window. At first I thought it was just a branch in the wind, but then I saw her. Isolde's face pressed against the glass, her long dark hair floating around her as if she were still underwater. Her milky eyes stared right at me, and her mouth opened in a silent scream. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. But when I looked again, she was gone. Only the locket on my nightstand gave any indication that it hadn't all been a dream. As I tried to calm my racing thoughts, I realized with growing dread that we were in way over our heads. Isolde's spirit was restless, the Blackwood family was hiding something, and Astria and I were caught in the middle of a century-old tragedy that threatened to consume us all. The next morning I called Astria as soon as I woke up, my voice shaking as I recounted my nighttime visitation from Isolde. She listened in stunned silence, then said, "We need to end this, Zephyr. Tonight." We agreed to meet at the edge of Shadowmere Forest at dusk. As I packed a backpack with flashlights, the locket, and some of our research notes, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something far more dangerous than we realized. The day crawled by, each minute feeling like an hour. When I finally met Astria at our designated spot, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. She looked as nervous as I felt. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, giving her one last chance to back out. Astria nodded, her jaw set with determination. We have to try. For Isolde. And for us. As we made our way through the darkening forest toward Shadowmere Lake, the woods seemed to close in around us. The familiar paths felt twisted and wrong, as if the very landscape was trying to keep us away from our destination. We had almost reached the lake when we heard voices ahead. Crouching behind a large oak, we peered through the underbrush to see Callum Blackwood and two of his friends standing at the water's edge. "I'm telling you, those freaks know something," Callum was saying, his voice tight with anger. "If they start digging too deep, it could ruin everything. My father would kill me if he knew I let this get out of hand." One of his friends, a burly guy I recognized from the football team, cracked his knuckles. "So what do you want us to do about it?" Callum's face twisted into a cruel smirk. "Scare them. Rough them up a little if you have to. Just make sure they understand that some stories are better left untold." Astria and I exchanged a horrified look. We had stumbled onto something bigger than we'd imagined. The Blackwood family wasn't just hiding an old scandal. They were actively working to keep the truth buried. We began to back away slowly, but Astria's foot caught on a root, sending her stumbling. The noise alerted Callum and his friends, who spun around to face us. "Well, well," Callum sneered. "Looks like the town freaks decided to take a little moonlight stroll. Bad move." As Callum and his friends advanced on us, the air suddenly grew cold. A thick mist began to rise from the lake, swirling around our feet. And then we heard it. A soft, mournful singing drifting across the water. Everyone froze. The singing grew louder, and I realized with a start that I recognized the melody. It was an old lullaby, one my grandmother used to sing to me when I was little. "What the hell is that?" one of Callum's friends whispered, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, a figure emerged from the mist. Isolde glided across the surface of the lake, her white dress billowing around her, her dark hair floating as if she were still underwater. Her eyes, no longer milky white but a deep, stormy gray, were fixed on Callum. Callum's face drained of all color. "No," he whispered. "It can't be. You're not real." Isolde's mouth opened, and when she spoke, her voice was like the rustling of dead leaves. "You carry the sins of your ancestors, Everett Blackwood. The time has come to pay for what was done to me." With a speed that defied her ethereal appearance, Isolde lunged forward, her cold, wet hands grasping Callum's shirt. He screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through the night air. His friends, overcome with fear, turned and ran, leaving Callum to his fate. Without thinking, I stepped forward, the locket clutched in my hand. "Isolde, wait!" Her head snapped towards me, those storm-gray eyes boring into mine. I held out the locket, my hand trembling. "This was yours, wasn't it? You were loved, Isolde, truly loved." Isolde's grip on Callum loosened slightly, her gaze fixed on the locket. Slowly, as if in a trance, she reached out to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed the metal, a pulse of energy surged through the air. Memories that weren't my own flooded my mind. Isolde and a young man with kind eyes laughing by the lake, stolen kisses in the shadow of tall pines, whispered promises of a future together. "Finn," Isolde breathed, her voice suddenly soft and full of longing. Astria stepped forward, her voice gentle. "He loved you, Isolde. He never forgot you. All these years it's been your love keeping you here, not your anger." Isolde's form seemed to flicker, becoming more transparent. She turned back to Callum, who was on his knees, shaking uncontrollably. "Your ancestor took everything from me," she said, her voice echoing with a century of pain. "But I won't let that define me any longer. Your family's sins are your own to bear now." With those words, Isolde began to fade, her form dissolving into mist. As she disappeared, the locket in my hand grew warm. I opened it to find a small, sepia-toned photograph inside. A young woman with Isolde's features, smiling next to a man who could only be Finn. Callum scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild. What? What just happened? I looked at him, feeling a mixture of pity and disgust. The truth came out, Callum. After all these years, Isolde's story has finally been told. What you do with that truth is up to you now. As if in a daze, Callum stumbled away into the darkness of the forest. Astria and I stood there for a long moment, the weight of what we'd just experienced settling over us. "Do you think it's really over?" Astria asked softly. I closed the locket, feeling its warmth against my palm. I think Isolde is at peace now, but the legacy of what happened here, that's something this town will have to reckon with for a long time to come. We made our way back through the forest, the paths now clear and familiar once more. As we emerged from the tree line, the first light of dawn was breaking over Willowbrook. It felt symbolic somehow, the long, dark night of secrets and shadows giving way to the harsh light of truth. In the weeks that followed, the story of Isolde and the Blackwood family's dark past came to light. Old records were discovered. Witnesses came forward with stories that had been passed down through generations. The town was forced to confront its history, with all its ugly truths and long-buried secrets. Callum and his family left Willowbrook soon after, unable to face the shame and scrutiny. Last I heard, the Blackwood estate was being turned into a historical museum, dedicated to preserving the true history of our town. As for Astria and me, we found that our brush with the supernatural had changed us. We were no longer content to be victims of our circumstances. With the support of a few caring adults who had finally opened their eyes to what was happening, we were able to escape our abusive homes and start building better lives for ourselves. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still find myself drawn to the shores of Shadowmere Lake. But now, when I look out over its dark waters, I don't feel fear. Instead, I feel a sense of peace and the faint echo of a love that was strong enough to transcend death itself. The locket sits on my dresser, a reminder of the power of truth and the importance of confronting the shadows of the past. And though I know there are still dark things lurking in the corners of the world, I face them now with courage, knowing that even the deepest, darkest secrets cannot stay buried forever. I've always felt a deep connection to nature. As a child growing up in the bustling city of Seattle, my happiest memories were of the camping trips my parents would take us on during the summers. Those brief escapes into the wilderness left an indelible mark on my soul, a yearning for something more than the concrete and steel of urban life. My name is Alex Hawthorne, and this is the story of how I discovered that the world is far stranger and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. I was 28 when I finally made the decision to leave my unfulfilling job as a software developer and pursue my dream of becoming a forest ranger. My parents thought I was crazy, giving up a lucrative career for a life of relative solitude in the woods. But I knew in my heart that it was the right choice. After months of rigorous training and certification processes, I landed a position at Evergreen Haven National Park, one of the largest and most remote wilderness areas in the Pacific Northwest. The park spanned over 1 million acres of pristine forest, rugged mountains, and crystal-clear lakes. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, but also of deep mystery. My first day at Evergreen Haven was a crisp autumn morning. The air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth as I drove my old pickup truck along the winding road to the ranger station. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, their leaves a vibrant tapestry of red, gold, and orange. As I pulled up to the station, a grizzled older man stepped out to greet me. This was Frank Holloway, the chief ranger and my new boss. Frank was a legend in the Park Service, with over 30 years of experience under his belt. His weathered face broke into a warm smile as he shook my hand. "Welcome to Evergreen Haven, rookie," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. "Hope you're ready for an adventure." Little did I know just how prophetic those words would turn out to be. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity as I settled into my new role. Frank and the other rangers showed me the ropes, teaching me the intricacies of park management, wildlife conservation, and search and rescue operations. I threw myself into the work with enthusiasm, relishing every moment spent in the great outdoors. My assigned patrol area was the eastern sector of the park, a vast stretch of old-growth forest that included the mysterious Shadowmere Lake. It was a remote and seldom visited part of Evergreen Haven, and I soon came to love its wild, untamed beauty. But as the days grew shorter and winter approached, I began to notice strange occurrences in my sector. At first they were small things, easily dismissed as tricks of the light or overactive imagination. A shadow moving in the corner of my eye when no one was there. Whispers on the wind that seemed to form words just beyond my understanding. Tracks in the mud that didn't match any animal I knew. I mentioned these oddities to Frank during one of our weekly meetings, but he just chuckled and shook his head. "The forest plays tricks on you sometimes, Alex," he said, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Especially as winter sets in. You'll get used to it." But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. Something about the way Frank avoided my gaze when he said it, the slight tension in his shoulders, made me wonder if he knew more than he was letting on. As winter settled over Evergreen Haven, blanketing the forest in snow, the strange occurrences increased in frequency and intensity. One frigid December night, while on a routine patrol near Shadowmere Lake, I had my first truly inexplicable experience. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the snow-covered landscape. The lake, usually a mirror-like surface, was churning and bubbling as if boiling, despite the sub-zero temperatures. And there, at the center of the lake, I saw something that defied all logic and reason. A massive shape rose from the depths, water cascading off its form in frozen sheets. It was unlike anything I had ever seen or imagined. Tentacles the size of redwoods writhed in the air, and countless eyes blinked open along its impossible body, each one fixing me with an alien gaze that seemed to pierce straight through to my soul. I stood there, paralyzed with fear and awe, as the entity slowly sank back into the depths of Shadowmere Lake. As it disappeared, the water instantly calmed, freezing over as if nothing had disturbed it. With shaking hands, I reached for my radio to call it in, but before I could, a hand clasped my shoulder. I spun around, heart pounding, to find Frank standing behind me, his face grave in the moonlight. "You weren't supposed to see that, Alex," he said softly. "But now that you have, there's something I need to tell you. Something about the true nature of Evergreen Haven, and the real reason we're here." As Frank began to speak, I felt the foundations of my reality begin to crumble. The world I thought I knew was about to change forever, and there would be no going back. Frank's revelation hit me like a physical blow. The words he spoke seemed to hang in the frigid air between us, each one more unbelievable than the last. "Evergreen Haven isn't just a national park, Alex," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It's a containment zone, a place where the fabric of reality is thin, allowing things from other dimensions to slip through." I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. "Other dimensions? Frank, what are you talking about?" He sighed heavily, his breath forming a cloud in the cold air. "I know it sounds crazy, but what you just saw, that's only the tip of the iceberg. There are things in these woods that would shatter most people's understanding of the world. And it's our job to keep them contained, to protect not just the park visitors, but the entire world from what lies beyond." As we stood there in the moonlight, Frank told me a story that stretched back to the founding of Evergreen Haven. The park, it turned out, had been established not just for conservation, but as a cover for a top-secret government program aimed at studying and containing interdimensional phenomena. The first incidents were reported by Native American tribes long before European settlers arrived, Frank explained. They spoke of a place where the spirit world bled into ours, where strange creatures roamed, and reality itself seemed to warp. When the government finally took notice in the early 20th century, they knew they had to do something to control it. He went on to describe how a specialized unit had been formed within the National Park Service, trained to deal with supernatural and interdimensional threats. Rangers like us were the first line of defense, our seemingly mundane patrols actually a constant vigil against incursions from beyond. "But why me?" I asked, still struggling to come to terms with what I was hearing. "Why are you telling me all this now?" Frank's expression was grim. "Because the incursions are increasing, Alex. The barrier between worlds is weakening, and we need all hands on deck. I've been watching you since you arrived, and I believe you have what it takes to join our special unit. But I need to know if you're willing to accept this responsibility. Once you're in, there's no going back to the life you knew before." I stood there in silence, my mind reeling. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as an elaborate joke, to believe that any moment Frank would crack a smile and tell me he was just hazing the new guy. But I couldn't deny what I had seen with my own eyes. The creature in the lake, the strange occurrences I'd been noticing, it all suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. I need some time to think," I stammered. Frank nodded understanding. "Take the night. But remember, Alex, knowledge is a burden. Whether you choose to join us or not, you can never unknow what you've learned here. Meet me at the main ranger station at dawn with your decision." As I watched Frank disappear into the dark forest, I felt as if the ground had shifted beneath my feet. The world I thought I knew had been irrevocably changed, and I was left to grapple with a reality far more vast and terrifying than I had ever imagined. That night, as I lay sleepless in my cabin, I wrestled with the choice before me. Could I really believe what Frank had told me? And if it was true, could I bear the weight of that knowledge, the responsibility of standing guard against threats from beyond our reality? As the first light of dawn began to creep through my window, I made my decision. I dressed quickly and made my way to the main ranger station, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Frank was waiting for me on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. He said nothing, simply raising an eyebrow in question. I took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm in," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Whatever this is, whatever we're facing, I want to help." A small smile crossed Frank's weathered face. "I had a feeling you'd say that," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Welcome to the team, Alex. Now let's get you up to speed on what we're really dealing with here in Evergreen Haven." As I followed Frank into the station, I knew that my life would never be the same. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but I was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did I know just how great those challenges would be, or how they would test the very limits of my sanity and courage in the days to come. The next few weeks were a blur of intense training and mind-bending revelations. Frank introduced me to a hidden facility deep within Evergreen Haven, a high-tech operations center that seemed wildly out of place in the middle of the wilderness. Here I met the core team of the Interdimensional Containment Unit, ICU, a diverse group of specialists from various fields. There was Dr. Elena Rossi, a brilliant physicist whose theories on dimensional barriers had laid the groundwork for much of the ICU's technology. Captain Marcus Steele, a former Special Forces operator who now led the unit's tactical response team. And Sarah Chen, a linguistic expert who had made remarkable progress in deciphering the languages of some of the interdimensional entities we encountered. My training was intense and often terrifying. I learned to use advanced containment gear, weapons that fired pulses of energy designed to disrupt interdimensional entities, and sensors that could detect rifts in the fabric of reality. But more challenging than the physical training was coming to terms with the new worldview I was forced to adopt. The universe is far stranger and more complex than most humans can comprehend, Dr. Rossi explained during one of our briefing sessions. What we perceive as our reality is just one layer of a vast, multidimensional cosmos. and sometimes the barriers between these dimensions weaken, allowing things to slip through. The entities we dealt with ranged from the merely bizarre to the utterly terrifying. Some were almost benign, curious explorers from other realities who meant no harm. Others were predatory, seeing our world as nothing more than a new hunting ground. And some defied categorization altogether, their motives and nature incomprehensible to human minds. My first real mission came about a month into my training. An alert came in from one of our remote sensors near the northern boundary of the park. A rift was opening, and something was coming through. Captain Steele led our team, consisting of myself, Sarah, and 2 other experienced ICU operatives. We boarded a specially equipped helicopter, its stealth technology ensuring we wouldn't attract attention as we flew to the site. As we approached, I saw it, a shimmering tear in the air, like heat haze but more substantial. And emerging from it was a creature that seemed to be constantly shifting form, one moment resembling a massive wolf, the next a tangle of writhing tentacles. "Phase shifter," Steele growled, readying his containment gear. "Tricky bastards. Alex, you're with me. Sarah, coordinate with base and prepare the dimensional anchor." My heart was pounding as we touched down. The creature, the phase shifter, turned its attention to us, a sound like grinding metal emanating from what might have been its mouth. "Remember your training," Steele said calmly as we approached. "Containment field first, then we drive it back through the rift." I nodded, trying to keep my hands steady as I activated my containment projector. A shimmering field of energy sprang to life around the creature, causing it to writhe and screech. For the next hour, we engaged in a desperate battle to contain and repel the entity. It lashed out with limbs that seemed to phase in and out of our reality, each strike narrowly missing us. The air was filled with the scent of ozone and the creature's alien shrieks. Finally, with a coordinated burst from our energy weapons and Sarah's activation of the dimensional anchor, we managed to force the phase shifter back through the rift. As it vanished, the tear in reality sealed itself with a sound like tearing fabric. We stood there, panting and exhausted, as the forest around us gradually returned to normal. Birds began to sing again, and the oppressive feeling of wrongness that had permeated the air slowly dissipated. "Good work, team," Steele said, a note of approval in his voice. "Especially you, Alex. Not bad for your first time in the field." As we flew back to base, I felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror. The world had just become a much larger, much more dangerous place. But I also felt a sense of purpose I had never known before. We were the thin line protecting our reality from chaos, and I was now a part of that line. Little did I know that this was just the beginning. In the months and years to come, I would face challenges that would test the very limits of my sanity and courage. The veil between worlds was thinning, and the entities on the other side were becoming bolder, more aggressive in their incursions. Evergreen Haven was about to become the front line in a war for the very fabric of reality itself. And I, Alex Hawthorne, once a simple forest ranger, would find myself at the heart of this cosmic conflict. As the months passed, I settled into my new role with the ICU. Each day brought new challenges and revelations about the true nature of our reality. The incidents we responded to ranged from minor dimensional breaches that we could seal quickly to full-scale incursions that required all hands on deck. One crisp autumn morning, about 6 months into my new role, I was out on a routine patrol near Shadowmere Lake when my dimensional sensor began to emit a low, pulsing tone. Something was coming through, but the signal was unlike anything I'd seen before. I radioed back to base. "This is Alex. I'm picking up an anomaly near Shadowmere, but the readings are strange." Dr. Rossi's voice crackled over the comm. "Define strange, Alex." "It's like it's there and not there at the same time. The signal keeps phasing in and out." There was a pause. Then Dr. Rossi's voice came back, tinged with urgency. "Alex, get out of there now. We're sending a full team. This could be a Class 5 entity." My blood ran cold. In all my time with the ICU, we'd never encountered anything above a Class 3. Class 5 was theoretical, an entity so powerful it could potentially reshape reality itself. Before I could respond, the air in front of me began to ripple and distort. The trees seemed to bend and warp, their forms becoming fluid and unstable. And then, emerging from what looked like a tear in the fabric of space itself, came something. It was impossible to describe accurately. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. It was as if multiple realities were overlapping, creating a being that existed in several states simultaneously. One moment it appeared humanoid, the next it was a writhing mass of tentacles, then a swirling vortex of energy. I stood frozen, my training momentarily forgotten in the face of this impossible entity. It turned what might have been its attention towards me, and I felt a pressure in my mind, as if something vast and alien was trying to communicate. Images flooded my consciousness. Strange alien landscapes, civilizations beyond human comprehension, the birth and death of universes. I felt my sense of self beginning to fragment under the onslaught of information. Just as I thought my mind would shatter, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Alex, snap out of it!" It was Frank leading the response team. They had arrived just in time. As I struggled to regain my senses, I saw the team deploying a new piece of equipment, a large ring-shaped device that began to hum with energy. "Dimensional stabilizer," Frank shouted over the growing chaos. "It should force the entity to fully materialize in our reality. Once it does, hit it with everything we've got." The next few minutes were a blur of frantic activity. The stabilizer did its job, forcing the entity to take on a more solid form, a towering crystalline structure that pulsed with internal light. We unleashed our arsenal of dimensional disruptors, each blast causing fractures to appear in the entity's form. But it wasn't going down without a fight. Tendrils of energy lashed out, warping the reality around them. Trees twisted into impossible shapes, the ground beneath our feet became unstable, shifting between solid and liquid states. In the midst of the chaos, I noticed something odd. There was a pattern to the entity's movements, a rhythm to its attacks. It reminded me of something. "It's defending itself," I shouted to Frank. "I don't think it's trying to attack us, it's scared." Frank looked at me like I was crazy, but something in my voice must have reached him. "Cease fire," he ordered. As our attack stopped, the entity's defensive actions also slowed. The reality warping around us began to stabilize. Cautiously, I stepped forward, my hands raised in what I hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "We mean you no harm," I said, feeling slightly foolish talking to a being that probably didn't understand English. To my surprise, the entity's form shifted again, taking on a roughly humanoid shape. A sound filled the air, not quite speech, but somehow conveying meaning. "Your kind defenders?" The concepts, rather than the words themselves, seemed to form in my mind. "Yes," I replied. "We protect our reality. We thought you were invading." There was a pause, then, "Mistake, fleeing, hunters, dark ones, consume all." A chill ran down my spine. Were there things out there that hunted beings like this? Entities so powerful they could traverse dimensions at will? Before I could ask more, the being's form began to flicker. "Must go. Thank you, defenders. Warning, they come." With that, the entity vanished, the tear in reality sealing behind it. The forest was left in an eerie silence, the only evidence of our encounter the twisted vegetation and our shell-shocked team. Frank approached me, his face a mix of awe and concern. "Alex, what the hell just happened?" I shook my head, still trying to process it all. I think we just got a warning. Something's coming, Frank. Something big." As we made our way back to base, my mind was reeling. We had just made first contact with a being from another dimension, one that wasn't hostile, but its warning left me with a deep sense of dread. If there were things out there that could hunt such powerful entities, what chance did we stand against them? I knew that our mission had just become far more complex. We weren't just protecting our reality anymore, we were potentially facing a threat to the entire multiverse. As the sun set over Evergreen Haven, casting long shadows through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the brink of something monumental. The veil between worlds was thinning, and whatever was on the other side was about to change everything. Little did I know that this encounter was just the beginning of a cosmic conflict that would push us to the very limits of our understanding and capabilities. The true test was yet to come, and I wondered if we would be ready when it did. In the weeks following our encounter with the Class 5 entity, an air of tension settled over Evergreen Haven. The warning it had given us, "They come," echoed in my mind constantly, a foreboding reminder of the unknown threat looming on the horizon. Dr. Rossi and her team worked tirelessly to analyze the data we had gathered during the incident. The rest of us intensified our patrols and training, preparing for whatever might come next. It was during this time that I began to notice subtle changes in the park itself. The fog that often shrouded the valleys seemed thicker, more persistent. Wildlife behavior became erratic. Nocturnal animals were active during the day, while diurnal creatures were rarely seen. The very air felt charged, as if the entire forest was holding its breath in anticipation. One evening, as I was returning from a long patrol near the western border of the park, I came across something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the trunk of an ancient redwood was a symbol, a complex, spiraling glyph that seemed to writhe and shift as I looked at it. I recognized it from our training sessions, a warning sign used by interdimensional travelers to mark dangerous territories. I reported the finding to Frank immediately. His face grew grim as I described the symbol. "It's worse than we thought," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "They're already here." "Who's here, Frank?" I pressed. "What aren't you telling me?" He sighed heavily, suddenly looking much older than his years. "Come with me, Alex. It's time you knew the whole truth." Frank led me to a part of the hidden facility I'd never seen before, a secure vault deep underground. Inside was a room filled with artifacts and documents, each more bizarre than the last. At the center was a large circular stone tablet covered in the same type of shifting glyphs I'd seen on the tree. "This tablet was discovered when Evergreen Haven was first established," Frank explained. "It's taken us decades to decipher even a fraction of it, but what we've learned is troubling." He went on to tell me about an ancient conflict, a war that spanned multiple dimensions. On one side were beings of pure chaos, entities that sought to break down the barriers between realities and merge all of existence into a roiling sea of possibility. Opposing them were the Guardians, a loose alliance of different species and civilizations, united in their desire to maintain the separation between dimensions. Earth, our entire universe, is just one battlefield in this cosmic war, Frank said. Evergreen Haven is a strategic location, a nexus point where the barriers between dimensions are naturally thin. Both sides have been vying for control of it for millennia. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Everything we'd been doing, the containment, the patrols, it wasn't just about protecting our world. We were soldiers in a war most of humanity didn't even know was happening. "So the entities we've been encountering," I began. "Scouts mostly," Frank nodded. "Small incursions testing our defenses. But this," he gestured to the symbol I'd found, which he'd sketched on a notepad. "This suggests that the enemy is preparing for a major offensive." As if to punctuate his words, an alarm began to blare throughout the facility. Red emergency lights bathed the room in an eerie glow. "Multiple breaches detected," a computerized voice announced. "All personnel to battle stations." Frank and I shared a look of grim determination before rushing to the control room. The main screen showed a map of Evergreen Haven, now lit up with dozens of red dots indicating dimensional breaches. "It's starting," Dr. Rossi said as we entered, her voice tense. "The invasion we've been preparing for all these years. It's finally here." Captain Steele was already coordinating response teams. his voice steady as he issued rapid-fire orders. Team Alpha to the North Quadrant, Bravo to the east. Charlie and Delta, shore up the perimeter around the central facility. Alex, Frank turned to me, his eyes intense. I need you with me. We're going to Shadowmere Lake. As we geared up and headed out, I couldn't help but feel a mix of terror and exhilaration. Everything I'd learned, everything I'd trained for had been leading to this moment. The fate of not just our world, but countless others, hung in the balance. The drive to Shadowmere Lake was tense, the usual beauty of the forest now tinged with an air of menace. The fog was thicker than I'd ever seen it, swirling with unnatural patterns and flashes of strange colors. As we neared the lake, we saw it. A massive tear in reality, easily 100 feet across, hovering above the water's surface. Through it, I could see glimpses of alien landscapes and impossible geometries. And emerging from the rift were things. Creatures that defied description, each more terrifying than the last. Some flowed like living liquid. Others seemed to be composed of pure energy. There were beings that hurt to look at directly, their forms constantly shifting and changing. Frank brought our vehicle to a screeching halt. "Remember your training," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos unfolding before us. "We're not just fighting for ourselves now. We're fighting for every innocent soul in every dimension." I nodded, my mouth dry but my resolve firm. As we stepped out to face the oncoming horde, I knew that this was it. The moment that would define not just my life, but the fate of all reality. The battle for Evergreen Haven, and for the very fabric of existence, had begun. As Frank and I faced the swirling maelstrom of interdimensional entities pouring from the rift above Shadowmere Lake, I felt a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. The sheer scale of what we were up against was overwhelming. But then I remembered why we were here, what we were fighting for, and I steeled myself for the battle ahead. We activated our dimensional disruptors, the air around us humming with energy as the defensive field sprang to life. The first wave of entities hit us like a tsunami of nightmares. Writhing tentacles, bodies of living flame, creatures that seemed to exist in multiple states at once, all crashed against our defenses. "Hold the line!" Frank shouted over the cacophony of alien shrieks and the crackle of our weapons. "We just need to buy enough time for Dr. Rossi to activate the dimensional stabilizer." I nodded, focusing my efforts on a particularly persistent entity that resembled a constantly shifting cloud of metallic shards. Each blast from my disruptor seemed to only momentarily disperse it before it reformed, inching closer. All around us, the very fabric of reality was starting to fray. Trees twisted into impossible shapes. The ground beneath our feet alternated between solid and liquid states, and the sky above swirled with colors that shouldn't exist in our spectrum. Just when it seemed we might be overwhelmed, a familiar voice crackled over our comms. "This is Dr. Rossi. Dimensional stabilizer is online in 3, 2, 1. A pulse of energy rippled out from the center of the park, momentarily causing everything to flicker like a bad TV signal. As it passed, I felt a sense of solidness return to the world around us. The rift above the lake shuddered and began to shrink. "It's working!" I yelled to Frank, a surge of hope rising in my chest. But our celebration was premature. As the rift contracted, a new entity emerged, one larger and more terrifying than anything we'd faced before. It was vast, its form constantly shifting between states of matter, radiating an aura of such alien malevolence that I felt my mind recoil at the sight of it. "Coordinator," Frank breathed, his face pale. "Alex, fall back. We need to regroup." As we retreated, the entity, the coordinator, let out a psychic blast that brought us to our knees. Images flooded my mind. Worlds consumed by chaos, realities collapsing, the very concepts of space and time unraveling. Through the mental onslaught, I heard Frank's voice, distant but insistent. "The tablet, Alex. Remember the tablet." Fighting against the psychic attack, I forced my mind to focus on the strange, shifting glyphs we'd seen in the underground vault. As I did, I felt something click into place in my consciousness. Suddenly, the swirling symbols made sense. They weren't just warnings, they were instructions. "Frank!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "The glyphs! They're a code! A way to communicate with these entities!" Understanding dawned in Frank's eyes. "Can you do it? Can you talk to that thing?" I nodded, not fully confident, but knowing we had no other choice. Stepping forward, I focused my mind on the patterns I'd seen, projecting them outward towards the coordinator. The effect was immediate. The psychic assault ceased, and the massive entity turned its attention fully on me. I felt its alien consciousness probe my mind, curious and wary. Using the mental patterns I'd gleaned from the tablet, I tried to convey our purpose, our desire to maintain the separation between dimensions, the importance of balance in the multiverse. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, there was no response. Then, slowly, I felt a shift in the entity's demeanor. Not friendship exactly, but a kind of understanding. To my astonishment, the coordinator began to retreat, drawing the other entities back with it. The rift pulsed once, twice, and then began to close. As the last of the invaders disappeared, and the rift sealed itself with a sound like thunder, an eerie silence fell over Shadowmere Lake. Frank and I stood there, scarcely believing what had just happened. "Alex," Frank said slowly, "I think you just negotiated a ceasefire with an interdimensional being." The realization of what I'd done began to sink in. Somehow, I'd not only communicated with the coordinator, but had convinced it to withdraw. The implications were staggering. As we made our way back to base, exhausted but triumphant, I knew that this was just the beginning. We'd won a battle, but the war was far from over. The multiverse was larger and more complex than we'd ever imagined, and our role in it had just expanded significantly. In the days that followed, as we worked to repair the damage done to Evergreen Haven and strengthen our defenses, I spent hours studying the tablet, working with Dr. Rossi to decipher more of its secrets. We were no longer just guardians, we were becoming diplomats in a cosmic conflict. The incident at Shadowmere Lake had changed everything. We now knew that communication, understanding, and negotiation were possible, even with beings so alien we could scarcely comprehend them. It opened up new avenues for our work, but also new dangers. As I stood on the shore of Shadowmere Lake one evening, watching the sun set over its now calm waters, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the vastness of the multiverse and our place in it. We had taken our first steps into a larger reality, and there was no telling where it might lead us. The veil had been lifted, and there was no going back. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew that all of us in the ICU would face them head on, protecting our world and striving for understanding in the cosmic tapestry of the multiverse. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I wondered what other wonders and terrors were out there, waiting to be discovered. Our journey was just beginning, and the greatest adventures and greatest dangers still lay ahead. In the months following the Battle of Shadowmere Lake, Evergreen Haven underwent a transformation. What was once a hidden containment facility became a hub of interdimensional diplomacy and research. Dr. Rossi's team made breakthrough after breakthrough in understanding the nature of the multiverse, while Sarah Chen's linguistic skills proved invaluable in our growing communications with other dimensional entities. I found myself at the center of much of this activity. My ability to interpret the glyphs and communicate with the coordinator had marked me as something of a savant in interdimensional relations. It was a role I never expected, but one I embraced with determination and curiosity. One crisp autumn morning, almost a year to the day since the invasion, Frank called me into his office. His face was grave, but there was a glimmer of excitement in his eyes. "Alex," he said, "we've received a message from them." I knew immediately who he meant. The coordinator and its kind had been silent since their retreat, leaving us to wonder if our ceasefire would hold. "What do they want?" I asked, my heart racing. Frank handed me a tablet. On it was a series of shifting glyphs, similar to those on the ancient stone tablet, but far more complex. "We need you to translate it," he said. "Dr. Rossi thinks it's an invitation." I spent the next several hours poring over the message, my mind stretching to comprehend the alien concepts it contained. When I finally decoded it, I was left in awe. The coordinator wasn't just reaching out to us. It was inviting us to a cosmic summit, a gathering of representatives from various dimensions to discuss the future of the multiverse. The implications were staggering. We wouldn't just be protecting our world anymore. We'd be taking part in shaping the very nature of reality itself. The preparations for the summit were intense. We had no idea what to expect or how to prepare for a meeting with beings from across the multiverse. Every member of the ICU worked tirelessly, developing new technologies, studying everything we knew about interdimensional interactions, and trying to anticipate every possible scenario. Finally, the day arrived. A new rift opened above Shadowmere Lake, but this time, it was stable, controlled. As our team approached, I felt a mix of terror and exhilaration. We were about to go where no humans had gone before, into the spaces between dimensions. As we stepped through the rift, the world around us transformed. We found ourselves in a place that defied description, a vast, swirling nexus where realities bled into one another. Beings of all shapes and forms surrounded us, some recognizable, others utterly alien. At the center of it all was the coordinator. Up close, its true nature was even more awe-inspiring. It wasn't just a single entity, but a collective consciousness, a representation of its entire dimension. The summit itself was unlike anything I could have imagined. Ideas and concepts were exchanged not just through words or gestures, but through direct mental communication. We learned of threats to the multiverse that dwarfed anything we'd faced before, but also of wonders beyond our wildest dreams. As the summit progressed, a new understanding began to emerge. The conflicts between dimensions, the invasions we'd been fighting against. They were often the result of misunderstanding, fear, or desperate attempts at survival in a hostile multiverse. Our role, we realized, wasn't just to defend our dimension, but to act as mediators, diplomats in a cosmic-scale conflict. The ability to communicate, to understand different perspectives across realities, was more powerful than any weapon we could devise. As the summit drew to a close, a new accord was reached. A coalition of dimensions working together to maintain the delicate balance of the multiverse. And Earth, thanks to our unique position and the work we'd done, would play a crucial role. When we returned to Evergreen Haven, everything had changed. The park was no longer just a containment zone, but a neutral ground for interdimensional meetings. Our team wasn't just a defense force, but a key part of a larger cosmic peacekeeping operation. Years have passed since that first summit. We've faced new challenges, made incredible discoveries, and forged alliances with beings beyond imagination. The work is dangerous, often terrifying, but also more rewarding than I ever could have dreamed. As I stand here now, on the shore of Shadowmere Lake, watching a controlled rift shimmer above the water, a gateway to another dimension where we're helping to mitigate a reality-threatening crisis, I can't help but marvel at the journey that brought me here. From a simple forest ranger to a cosmic diplomat, my path has been extraordinary. But I know that this is just the beginning. The multiverse is vast, full of wonders and dangers we have yet to encounter. And we'll be there, at the forefront, protecting, exploring, and striving for understanding across the dimensions. The veil has been lifted, and our true work has only just begun. Life on the edge of Raven's Peak is as close as you can get to truly being off the grid without disappearing entirely. It suits me fine. The air is crisp, the sky is vast, and my nearest neighbor is more than a shout away. My cabin, perched at the highest accessible point of my property near an old barn, faces a road that hardly merits the name, and beyond that, the endless dark embrace of the forest. This mountain, steeped in local lore, has always been a character in its own right in the stories told by the indigenous elders. They speak of it with a respectful fear, cautioning that the spirits dwelling here do not take kindly to human intrusion. I've learned to listen to these subtleties over the years. The land has a language all its own. As I sit on my porch, nursing a steaming mug of coffee, I can't shake the feeling that something is off. The wind whispers through the pines, carrying with it a chill that seems out of place for early autumn. I pull my jacket tighter around me, my eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing seems amiss, yet the unease persists. I've lived here for 2 decades now, and I've grown accustomed to the mountain's moods. But today there's a tension in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Only there isn't a cloud in the sky. My dogs, Shadow and Luna, lie at my feet, their ears pricked forward, alert. They feel it too, whatever it is. As the sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I head inside. The cabin feels safe, a refuge from the growing darkness outside. I busy myself with dinner preparations, trying to shake off the strange feeling that's been dogging me all day. It's as I'm washing up the dishes that I hear it, a distant wail of sirens. One, then another, then a third. In 20 years, I've rarely heard sirens up here. The sound fades as quickly as it came, leaving behind a silence that seems to press against my eardrums. I try to rationalize it. Maybe there was an accident on the main road. It happens, especially when tourists underestimate the mountain's treacherous turns. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispers that this is just the beginning. Sleep doesn't come easy that night. I toss and turn, my dreams filled with shadowy figures and distant, inhuman cries. I wake to find the power out. It's not unusual up here, where storms or fallen trees often knock out the electricity. But as I go through my morning routine by lamplight, I can't help but feel that this outage is somehow different. I spend the morning chopping wood, the rhythmic thunk of the axe a welcome distraction from my unease. Shadow and Luna stick close, their usual enthusiasm for exploring the woods noticeably absent. By afternoon, the power's still out. I decide to make the trek into town for supplies and information. The drive down the mountain is tense. The forest seems to press in on the narrow road, branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Millbrook, the nearest town, is abuzz with rumors. The diner is packed, and I overhear snatches of conversation as I wait for my coffee. 3 cars just gone. Search and rescue couldn't find a trace. My cousin swears he saw something in the woods. I catch the eye of Sarah, the waitress. She's lived in Millbrook all her life, and if anyone knows what's going on, it's her. Quite the excitement, I say, nodding towards the crowded diner. Sarah leans in, her voice low. 3 separate incidents on the mountain road last night. Cars found abandoned, no sign of the drivers. Search and rescue been out since dawn. A chill runs down my spine. Any theories? She shrugs, but her eyes are worried. Official line is they wandered off, got lost in the dark, but... She trails off, glancing around before continuing. Some folks are saying it's the mountain, that it's hungry. I thank her, my appetite gone. As I drive back up the mountain, her words echo in my mind. The mountain hungry? It's nonsense, of course, and yet... The power comes back on just as I'm settling in for the night. The sudden brightness is almost shocking after a day spent in dimness. I should feel relieved, but instead the humming of the refrigerator and the soft glow of the lights only serve to heighten my sense of unease. What's out there in the dark? The morning brings a thick, cloying mist that clings to everything. It muffles sound and turns the familiar landscape into something alien and foreboding. I can barely see the old barn from my porch. I spend the morning indoors, catching up on work. As a freelance writer, I can go days without needing to interact with the outside world. Usually, I relish this solitude. Today, it feels oppressive. Around midday, the mist begins to lift, revealing a sky heavy with dark clouds. The weather report warns of a severe storm approaching. I secure everything outside and bring in extra firewood just in case. As I'm heading back to the cabin, I freeze. There, at the edge of the clearing, is a figure. For a moment, my heart leaps into my throat. Then I realize it's just a deer, a young buck, watching me with wide, dark eyes. We stare at each other for a long moment. There's something in its gaze, something almost knowing. Then it turns and bounds into the forest, leaving me with a feeling I can't quite name. The storm hits just after nightfall. Rain lashes against the windows, and wind howls around the eaves of the cabin. It sounds almost like voices, wailing in pain or fury. I'm halfway through a novel when the lights flicker and die. The sudden darkness is absolute. I fumble for my flashlight, my heart pounding. As I flick it on, a flash of lightning illuminates the room, and for a split second, I swear I see a face pressed against the window. I jerk back, nearly falling off the couch. Shadow and Luna start barking, a frenzied sound I've never heard from them before. I force myself to approach the window, shining the flashlight beam out into the storm. There's nothing there. Of course there isn't. It was just a trick of the light, my imagination running wild. I tell myself this over and over as I double-check the locks and close all the curtains. The storm rages all night. I don't sleep a wink. The storm has passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed. Trees are down everywhere, branches and debris scattered across my property. I spend the morning clearing what I can. The physical labor a welcome distraction from the events of the past few days. As I'm dragging a fallen branch to the woodpile, I notice something odd. There, in the soft earth near the tree line, is a footprint. But it's like no print I've ever seen before. It's huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, and the shape is all wrong. Too many toes, elongated and curved like claws. I stare at it, my mind refusing to process what I'm seeing. It can't be real. Maybe it's just an odd impression left by fallen debris. Maybe. A twig snaps in the forest, loud in the post-storm quiet. I whirl around, my heart in my throat. The trees stare back, impassive and dark. I hurry back to the cabin, my skin crawling with the feeling of unseen eyes upon me. Inside, I fire up my laptop, desperate for a connection to the outside world. The local news site is full of storm reports, but buried among them is a small article that makes my blood run cold. "Search for missing hikers continues," the headline reads. A group of 5 experienced outdoorsmen all vanished on the mountain 2 days ago. The article is frustratingly vague on details, but one line stands out. Unusual tracks found at campsite perplex investigators. I think of the strange footprint and shudder. As night falls, I find myself jumping at every sound. The creaking of the cabin settling, the wind in the trees, a sudden thump on the roof that's probably just a falling pine cone, but sounds like footsteps. I don't realize I've dozed off until I'm startled awake by a sound. A cry, high and desperate, somewhere between a child's scream and an animal's howl. Shadow and Luna explode into frenzied barking, clawing at the door. I'm on my feet before I know it, heart pounding. The cry comes again, closer this time. It sounds like it's coming from just beyond the tree line. Every instinct screams at me to stay inside, to not open that door. But what if someone's out there? What if they need help? My hand trembles as I reach for the doorknob. I open it a crack, peering out into the darkness. "Hello?" I call, my voice sounding small and frightened. "Is someone there?" The night is silent. Even the dogs have gone quiet. The silence stretches, becoming oppressive, expectant. Then, From the darkness comes a sound that turns my blood to ice. A low, rumbling growl, unlike anything I've ever heard before. It's not a bear, not a mountain lion. It's something else. I slam the door shut, fumbling with the locks. My breath comes in short, sharp gasps. What was that? What's out there? Sleep is impossible. I spend the night huddled on the couch, dogs pressed close on either side, jumping at every sound from the forest beyond. Dawn breaks, gray and cheerless. I've barely slept, my eyes gritty and sore from staring into the darkness. The forest looks innocent in the early morning light, but I know better now. There's something out there, something that doesn't belong. I spend the morning in a daze, going through the motions of my daily routine. Make coffee, feed the dogs, check the news. There's nothing new about the missing hikers, but there is a small item about strange animal sightings in the area. The article is vague, talking about unidentified large fauna and possible escaped exotic pets. I know what I heard last night was no escaped pet. As the day wears on, my fear begins to crystallize into determination. I can't just sit here waiting for whatever it is to come for me. I need answers. I dig out my old hiking gear and start packing a backpack. Flashlight, extra batteries, first aid kit, water, food. I strap on my hunting knife and, after a moment's hesitation, my rifle. I've never been much of a hunter, but its weight is reassuring. Just as I'm about to head out, my phone rings. It's Sarah from the diner. "Don't go into the woods," she says without preamble, her voice tight with fear. "What? How did you—" "Just listen," she cuts me off. "Something's happening on the mountain. People are going missing. Not just the hikers. 2 more last night. A couple driving up to their cabin. Car found empty on the road." I swallow hard. "What do you think is going on?" There's a long pause. When Sarah speaks again, her voice is barely above a whisper. "The elders say the mountain is waking up, that the old spirits are hungry. They're warning everyone to stay inside after dark, to not answer if you hear calling." A chill runs down my spine as I think of the cry I heard last night. "Thanks for the warning," I manage to say. After I hang up, I stand there for a long moment, backpack in hand. Every rational part of my brain is screaming at me to get in my truck and drive down the mountain, to not stop until I'm far, far away from here. But this is my home, has been for 20 years, and something is threatening it, threatening my neighbors, my community. I can't just run away. Decision made, I shoulder my pack and head out. Shadow and Luna whine as I leave, clearly unhappy about being left behind. "I'll be back soon," I promise them, hoping it's true. The forest is quiet as I start down one of the old hiking trails. Too quiet. No bird song, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It's as if the whole mountain is holding its breath. I've been walking for about an hour when I find the first sign that something is very, very wrong. There, in a small clearing, is a tent. It's been ripped to shreds, the fabric hanging in tatters. Around it, the ground is torn up, great furrows dug into the earth as if by massive claws. My heart pounding, I approach the ruined campsite. There's no blood, no signs of bodies, but the destruction is chilling. What could have done this? As I'm examining the tracks around the tent, trying to make sense of the strange, elongated prints, I hear it. A low, rumbling growl, the same sound I heard last night. It's close. Too close. I spin around, rifle raised, but there's nothing there. Just trees and shadows. But the growl comes again, and this time I can pinpoint its direction. It's coming from behind a large boulder about 50 yards away. Every instinct screams at me to run, but I know that whatever this thing is, it's faster than me. Stronger. My only chance is to face it. "Come on out!" I shout, surprised at the steadiness in my voice. "I know you're there." For a long moment, nothing happens. Then, slowly, something begins to emerge from behind the boulder. At first, all I can see is a dark shape, indistinct in the forest shadows. But as it moves into a patch of sunlight, I get my first clear look at the thing that's been terrorizing the mountain. It's impossible. That's the only word my mind can conjure as I stare at the creature. It's huge, easily 8 feet tall, with a body that seems to be a nightmarish blend of bear and man. Its fur is black as midnight, matted and tangled. Its face is a twisted parody of a human visage, with eyes that glow with an unnatural intelligence. I raise my rifle, but my hands are shaking so badly I can barely aim. The creature takes a step forward and I stumble back, my foot catching on a root. I go down hard, the rifle flying from my grasp. The monster is on me in an instant, its hot breath washing over my face. This is it, I think. This is how I die. But the killing blow doesn't come. Instead, the creature leans in close, its glowing eyes boring into mine. And then, to my utter shock, it speaks. "You do not belong here," it growls, its voice like gravel and thunder. "This mountain is ours. It has always been ours. You humans have forgotten the old ways, forgotten how to listen to the land. But now we will remind you." With that, it rears back and lets out a roar that shakes the very ground. Then, faster than should be possible for something its size, it turns and vanishes into the forest. I lie there for a long time, my heart pounding, my mind reeling. What I've seen, what I've heard, it changes everything. The stories the elders told, the warnings about the mountain spirits. They weren't metaphors or myths. They were real. As I finally managed to pick myself up and begin the long, shaky walk back to my cabin, I know that nothing will ever be the same. The mountain has awakened, and with it, forces beyond our understanding. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if I should run or stay and try to warn others. All I know is that the line between our world and something older, something wilder, has blurred, and we are no longer at the top of the food chain. The sun is setting as I reach my cabin. Shadow and Luna greet me with frantic barks and wagging tails, clearly relieved to see me. As I step inside and lock the door behind me, I can hear the wind picking up outside. But now I know it's not just the wind. It's a voice, ancient and powerful, whispering secrets and warnings on the night air. I collapse onto my couch, exhaustion and adrenaline warring in my body. My encounter in the woods plays on repeat in my mind. The creature's words echo in my ears. This mountain is ours. It has always been ours. What does this mean for me? For the town? For everyone who calls this mountain home? I wake with a start, disoriented. Sunlight streams through the windows, and for a moment I almost convince myself that yesterday was just a vivid nightmare. But the aches in my body and the mud caked on my boots tell a different story. I spend the morning in a daze, alternating between pacing the cabin and staring out the windows at the seemingly peaceful forest. Should I tell someone what I saw? Who would believe me? Around midday, I steel myself and make the call to the local ranger station. I report finding the destroyed campsite, careful to omit any mention of the creature. The ranger on the other end of the line sounds tired, stressed. They thank me for the information and assure me they'll send someone to investigate. As I hang up, I wonder if I've done the right thing. Will I be leading more people into danger? The day drags on, each hour feeling like an eternity. I try to distract myself with work, but I can't focus. Every sound from outside makes me jump. As evening approaches, I find myself drawn to the porch. The forest is bathed in the golden light of sunset, beautiful and serene. It's hard to reconcile this peaceful scene with the terror of yesterday. That's when I see it. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the lengthening shadows, stands a figure. For a heart-stopping moment, I think it's the creature from yesterday. But as my eyes adjust, I realize it's a person. An old woman, her silver hair gleaming in the fading light. I blink, and suddenly she's at the foot of my porch steps. I didn't see her move. She looks up at me, her dark eyes ancient and knowing. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she says. It's not really a question. I nod, unable to speak. She climbs the steps with a grace that belies her apparent age. "I am Esther," she says. "I speak for the elders." "The elders?" I manage to ask. "Those who remember the old ways. Those who know the truth of this mountain." She fixes me with a penetrating stare. "The spirits are restless. The balance has been disrupted." "By what?" I ask, dreading the answer. "By us. By humanity's endless expansion, our disregard for the natural world." She sighs, a sound full of ancient sorrow. "The creature you saw is a guardian, a protector of this land. It has slumbered for centuries, but now it wakes." "What can we do?" I ask, my voice barely a whisper. Esther's eyes seem to look through me into some distant past or possible future. "We must remember. We must listen. We must find a way to restore the balance." She reaches into a pouch at her waist and pulls out a small object. An amulet, carved from dark wood, hung on a leather cord. She presses it into my hand. It's warm to the touch, thrumming with an energy I can't explain. "Wear this," she says. "It will offer some protection, and it will help you hear the mountain's voice." Before I can ask any more questions, she turns and starts down the steps. At the bottom, she pauses and looks back. "The days ahead will be difficult, but you have a role to play in what's to come. Be brave, be wise, and above all, listen." With that, she walks into the gathering darkness. Within moments, she's gone, swallowed up by the forest as if she was never there. I stand on the porch for a long time, the amulet clutched in my hand, my mind reeling. The weight of responsibility settles on my shoulders. Whatever is happening on this mountain, I'm a part of it now. As night falls, I retreat inside, locking the door behind me. I slip the amulet over my head, feeling its warmth against my skin. Outside, the wind picks up, whispering through the trees. But now, I listen more closely. There's a rhythm to it, a pattern, almost like words. The mountain is trying to speak, and for the first time, I'm ready to listen. I wake before dawn, the amulet warm against my chest. The cabin is filled with a strange, expectant silence. Even Shadow and Luna are quiet, watching me with knowing eyes. As I step outside, the pre-dawn air is crisp and charged with energy. The forest seems different somehow, more alive. I can almost feel the trees breathing, the earth pulsing beneath my feet. I close my eyes and listen. Really listen, like Esther told me to. At first, there's nothing but the usual forest sounds. But then, slowly, I begin to hear something else. It's not quite a voice, not quite music, but something in between. A song as old as the mountains themselves. I don't understand the words, if they even are words, but I feel their meaning. The mountain is in pain. It's angry. But underneath that, there's a longing, a desire for balance, for harmony. I open my eyes, tears streaming down my face. I know what I have to do. I spend the day preparing. I pack a backpack with supplies, water, food, first aid kit. I strap on my hunting knife, more for comfort than any real expectation of using it. The rifle I leave behind. This isn't a battle that can be won with weapons. As the sun begins to set, I say goodbye to Shadow and Luna. They whine, sensing something important is happening, but stay behind as I've trained them to. I strike out into the forest, the amulet guiding my steps. I don't know where I'm going, but I trust that I'll end up where I need to be. The forest at night is a different world. Shadows dance in the corners of my vision. Strange calls echo through the trees. but I'm not afraid. The amulet pulses warmly, a constant reminder that I'm not alone. I walk for what feels like hours, climbing higher and higher up the mountain. The air grows thin, the terrain more rugged. Just as I'm beginning to wonder if I've made a terrible mistake, I break through the tree line into a small clearing. There, in the center of the clearing, stands the creature, the Guardian. It's even more imposing than I remembered, its massive form silhouetted against the star-filled sky. It turns to face me, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I feel the weight of its gaze, centuries of wisdom and wildness boring into me. I take a deep breath and step forward. "I'm here to listen," I say, my voice steady despite my pounding heart. "I'm here to understand." The Guardian regards me for a long moment. Then, slowly, it nods. What follows is indescribable. The Guardian doesn't speak, not in words. Instead, it shows me. Visions flood my mind. I see the mountain as it was thousands of years ago, pristine and wild. I see the first humans to settle here, living in harmony with the land. I see the gradual encroachment of the modern world, the damage we've done without even realizing it. I feel the mountain's pain as if it were my own, the loss of ancient trees, the pollution of streams, the disruption of delicate ecosystems. But I also feel its resilience, its deep, abiding love for all the creatures that call it home, including us. As the visions fade, I find myself on my knees, gasping for breath. The Guardian looms over me, but I'm no longer afraid. I understand now. "What can we do?" I ask, my voice hoarse. "How can we make this right?" The Guardian's response comes not in words, but in feelings, in impressions. Balance, respect, stewardship. We don't need to leave the mountain entirely, but we need to change how we live here. We need to remember that we're part of this ecosystem, not separate from it. I nod, understanding flowing through me. "I'll help," I promise. "I'll teach others. We'll do better." The Guardian makes a sound then, not the terrifying roar from before, but something softer, almost approving. It reaches out one massive paw and gently, so gently, touches the amulet around my neck. Warmth floods through me, and with it, knowledge. I know now how to hear the mountain, how to interpret its needs, how to help others do the same. As the first light of dawn breaks over the mountain, the Guardian steps back. It gives me one last look, a look that says more clearly than words ever could, "We're trusting you. Don't let us down." Then, in a blink, it's gone, melting into the forest as if it was never there. I make my way back down the mountain as the sun rises, my mind reeling but my purpose clear. There's so much work to be done, so many people to talk to convince, to teach. It won't be easy. Change never is. But as I approach my cabin, seeing it with new eyes, understanding for the first time how it fits into the larger tapestry of the mountain, I feel hope. The amulet is warm against my skin, a constant reminder of the responsibility I've been given and the trust that's been placed in me. The mountain has awakened, and now, finally, so have we. As I step onto my porch, Shadow and Luna bounding out to greet me, I take a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. For the first time in days, I smile. The future is uncertain, the path ahead challenging. But I'm ready. We're all part of this mountain story now. My name is Emily Carter, and I never believed in the supernatural. That is, until I moved to Oakwood Grove. It's a small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked while driving through. I came here for a teaching job at the local high school, eager to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. Little did I know that this quaint town harbored secrets that would challenge everything I thought I knew about reality. Oakwood Grove seemed picture-perfect at first glance. Charming Victorian houses lined the streets, their facades well maintained despite their age. The town square boasted a clock tower that chimed every hour, its sonorous tones echoing through the valley. The people were friendly, if a bit reserved, always ready with a smile but rarely divulging much about themselves or the town's history. I settled into a small cottage on the outskirts of town, right at the edge of the dense forest that surrounded Oakwood Grove on 3 sides. The rent was surprisingly affordable, and I soon found out why. The previous tenants had all left abruptly, citing various reasons that never quite added up. But I was too enchanted by the quaint charm of the place to pay much attention to local gossip. My first few weeks in Oakwood Grove were uneventful. I threw myself into my new job, getting to know my students and colleagues. The high school was a small, close-knit community, and I quickly felt at home there. But as autumn set in, bringing with it a perpetual mist that clung to the mountains, things began to change. It started with whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees outside my cottage. But as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, the whispers became more distinct. They seemed to come from the woods, carrying words in a language I couldn't understand. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One evening, as I was grading papers, I heard a knock at my door. It was Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "You've heard them too, haven't you?" she asked without preamble. "The whispers from the woods." I nodded, relieved that I wasn't going crazy, but also terrified by the confirmation that the whispers were real. Mrs. Henderson sighed, her shoulders sagging. "It's starting again," she muttered, "just like it did 30 years ago." "What's starting again?" I asked, my curiosity overcoming my fear. "Mrs. Henderson, what's going on in this town?" She looked at me for a long moment as if deciding whether or not to trust me. Finally, she spoke. "Oakwood Grove has a history, Miss Carter. A dark history that most folks here would rather forget. But the woods remember, and every so often they remind us." She went on to tell me a tale that sounded more like a horror story than local history. According to Mrs. Henderson, Oakwood Grove was built on land that once belonged to a Native American tribe. The settlers who founded the town had made a deal with the tribe's shaman, promising to respect the sacred grounds in the heart of the forest. But as the town grew, that promise was forgotten. "They built homes where they shouldn't have," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They cut down trees that had stood for centuries. And then the whispers started." She told me about a series of disappearances that had plagued the town 30 years ago. People vanishing without a trace, always on misty nights when the moon was full. The police had investigated but never found any leads. Eventually, the disappearances stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and the town tried to move on. "But now it's starting again," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes filled with dread. "The whispers are back, and it's only a matter of time before people start disappearing again." I wanted to dismiss her story as the ramblings of a superstitious old woman, but the fear in her eyes was too real, and it matched the unease I'd been feeling since the whispers began. As Mrs. Henderson left, she turned to me one last time. "Be careful, Miss Carter. When the mist rises and the moon is full, stay inside. And whatever you do, don't answer if something calls your name from the woods." That night I lay awake in bed, Mrs. Henderson's words echoing in my mind. The whispers from the woods seemed louder than ever, and for the first time, I thought I could almost make out words. They seemed to be calling, beckoning, promising secrets and wonders if only I would step into the mist. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block out the sound, but even in my dreams the whispers followed me, painting visions of ancient trees and shadowy figures moving in the mist. Little did I know that this was just the beginning. The secrets of Oakwood Grove were about to unravel, and I would find myself at the heart of a mystery that had been centuries in the making. The whispers in the woods were growing louder, and soon they would be impossible to ignore. The next few weeks passed in a haze of growing unease. The whispers from the woods continued nightly, becoming more insistent as the full moon approached. I found myself jumping at shadows, constantly looking over my shoulder. My students noticed my distraction, but I brushed off their concerns with weak smiles and vague excuses about not sleeping well. It was 2 days before the full moon when the first disappearance occurred. Jenny Mathers, a bright-eyed sophomore in my English class, didn't show up for school. At first, no one thought much of it. Teenagers skip school sometimes, after all. But when she didn't come home that night, the town went into a frenzy. Search parties were organized, led by Sheriff Tom Blackwood, a gruff man with a perpetual frown. I volunteered to help, driven by a mix of concern for my student and a nagging feeling that this was somehow connected to the whispers I'd been hearing. As we combed the woods surrounding the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The mist hung heavy between the trees, muffling sounds and playing tricks on the eye. More than once, I thought I saw shadowy figures flitting between the trunks, always just at the edge of my vision. "Miss Carter!" a voice called out. I turned to see Mark Stevens, Jenny's boyfriend, and another of my students jogging towards me. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Any news?" I asked, already knowing the answer from his expression. He shook his head. "Nothing. It's like she just vanished." He kicked at a fallen branch in frustration. "I don't understand. Jenny loves these woods. She knows them better than anyone. How could she just disappear?" I put a comforting hand on his shoulder, wishing I had answers to give him. As we stood there, I heard it again. The whispers. They seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, beyond where the search parties had ventured. Without thinking, I took a step in that direction. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. For a moment, I thought I heard Jenny's voice among them, calling out for help. "Miss Carter?" Mark's voice snapped me back to reality. I realized I had walked several steps into the mist, away from the search party. "Are you okay?" I shook my head, trying to clear it. "Yes, I'm fine. I just thought I heard—" I trailed off, not sure how to explain what I'd experienced. Mark looked at me strangely, then his eyes widened. "You heard it too, didn't you? The whispers?" I stared at him in shock. "You've heard them?" He nodded, glancing nervously at the deepening shadows around us. "Jenny and I both have. We thought we were going crazy. She wanted to find out where they were coming from. I told her it was a bad idea, but she wouldn't listen. And now—" His voice broke, and I saw tears welling up in his eyes. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be all right. But the truth was, I was just as scared and confused as he was. As night fell, Sheriff Blackwood called off the search until morning. The woods were too dangerous in the dark, he said, but as I looked at his face in the beam of my flashlight, I saw something there that chilled me to the bone. Fear. The sheriff, a man who had lived in Oakwood Grove his entire life, was afraid of these woods. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the ever-present whispers, I made a decision. I couldn't just sit by and wait for more people to disappear. I needed answers, and I had a feeling that the key to understanding what was happening lay in Oakwood Grove's history. The next day I went to the town library. It was a small building, its shelves crammed with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The librarian, a thin, bespectacled woman named Miss Pemberley, eyed me suspiciously as I asked about books on local history. "Why the sudden interest in our town's past, Miss Carter?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, then decided to be honest. "I've been hearing things in the woods, and with Jenny's disappearance, I just feel like there's something going on that's connected to the town's history." Miss Pemberley's face paled. For a moment I thought she was going to throw me out, but then her expression softened. "You're not the first to ask," she said softly. "Come with me." She led me to a back room filled with old documents and leather-bound books. From a locked cabinet, she pulled out a dusty tome. "This is the true history of Oakwood Grove," she said, placing it on the table in front of me. "It's not in the official records. Most people in town don't even know it exists. But if you're hearing the whispers, you need to know the truth." As I opened the book, dust motes dancing in the air around me, I had no idea that I was about to uncover secrets that would change my life forever. The whispers in the woods were growing louder and the full moon was approaching. Time was running out, and somewhere in these pages lay the key to saving Jenny, and perhaps the entire town of Oakwood Grove. The book Miss Pemberley gave me was a revelation. Its pages were filled with handwritten accounts dating back to the founding of Oakwood Grove in the early 1800s. As I read, a picture began to emerge that was far different from the town's official history. Oakwood Grove, it turned out, was not founded by peaceful settlers looking for a new home. It was established by a group of occultists led by a man named Ezekiel Blackwood, an ancestor of the current sheriff, I realized with a start. These occultists had been drawn to this area by legends of a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where one could commune with beings from beyond our reality. The Native American tribe that had lived here, the Nahuatl, had long been guardians of this sacred place. They had rituals and safeguards in place to prevent the barrier between worlds from weakening too much. But Ezekiel and his followers saw this as an opportunity. They wanted to tear down the veil completely, to gain power from the entities on the other side. The accounts described a massacre. The Nahuatl were killed or driven off, their sacred sites desecrated. Ezekiel used their artifacts and twisted their rituals for his own purposes. He and his followers built the town directly over the most potent sites, using the energy for their dark rituals. But something went wrong. The entities they contacted were not the benevolent spirits of knowledge and power they had hoped for. They were ancient, malevolent beings that saw our world as nothing more than a new feeding ground. The veil began to tear, and things started coming through. The final entry in the book, dated 1897, was written in a shaky hand. The whispers have begun again. They call to us from the woods, promising power, knowledge, freedom from mortal constraints. But I know the truth now. I've seen what lies beyond the veil. God forgive us for what we've done. If you're reading this, heed my warning. When the mist rises and the moon is full, bar your doors. Do not listen to the whispers. Do not answer if something calls your name. And above all, do not enter the heart of the woods. What sleeps there must never be awakened. I closed the book, my mind reeling from what I'd read. It seemed impossible, like something out of a horror novel. But it explained so much. The whispers, the disappearances, the town's strange atmosphere of secrets and fear. As I left the library, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The mist was already starting to rise from the woods, tendrils of it creeping down the streets of Oakwood Grove. And tomorrow night would be the full moon. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just sit by with this knowledge while more people disappeared. Jenny was still out there somewhere, and maybe, armed with the truth about the town's history, I could find her. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed allies, people who would believe me and help. Mark was the obvious choice. He had heard the whispers too, and he was desperate to find Jenny. And despite my initial skepticism, I found myself thinking of Mrs. Henderson. She knew more than she had told me. I was sure of it. As I walked home, plans forming in my mind, I felt the weight of the town's dark history pressing down on me. The whispers from the woods seemed louder than ever, and for the first time I thought I could make out words clearly. "Come to us, Emily. We've been waiting for you. We have so much to show you." I quickened my pace, my heart pounding. Tomorrow night, under the light of the full moon, I would venture into the heart of the woods. I would find Jenny, and I would put an end to whatever dark forces were at work in Oakwood Grove. But as the mist swirled around my feet and the whispers echoed in my ears, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap centuries in the making. The secrets of Oakwood Grove were about to be revealed, and I feared the cost of that knowledge might be higher than I was prepared to pay. The next day dawned gray and misty, the sun a pale disk barely visible through the thick clouds. As I got ready for school, I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom that hung over me. The knowledge I'd gained from the hidden history book weighed heavily on my mind. At school, the atmosphere was tense. Jenny's empty desk was a stark reminder of the danger lurking in the woods. I pulled Mark aside after class, my heart pounding as I told him what I'd discovered. To my relief, he believed me without question. "I knew there was something wrong with this town," he said, his voice a mix of fear and determination. "What's the plan? How do we find Jenny?" I hesitated. I think we need to go into the woods tonight, during the full moon. That's when the veil between worlds is thinnest, according to the book. If Jenny's still alive, that's our best chance of finding her." Mark's face paled, but he nodded. "I'm in, for Jenny." After school, I visited Mrs. Henderson. The old woman listened to my story with a grim expression, nodding occasionally as if I was confirming things she'd long suspected. "I was hoping it wouldn't come to this in my lifetime," she said when I'd finished. "But I suppose some secrets can't stay buried forever." She disappeared into her house for a moment, returning with a small, intricately carved wooden box. "This has been passed down in my family for generations. We were tasked with protecting it, though the meaning of the task was lost over time." She opened the box, revealing a strange amulet. It was made of a dark metal I couldn't identify, inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. "This was created by the Nahuatl shamans," Mrs. Henderson explained. "It's said to offer protection against the entities beyond the veil. Take it with you tonight. You're going to need all the help you can get." As the day wore on, I made my final preparations. I packed a backpack with flashlights, extra batteries, water, and some energy bars. I didn't know what to expect in the woods, but I wanted to be as prepared as possible. As night fell, I met Mark at the edge of the woods. Mrs. Henderson's amulet hung around my neck, a comforting weight against my chest. The mist was thicker than I'd ever seen it, swirling around our feet and obscuring the path ahead. "Are you sure about this?" Mark asked, his voice shaking slightly. I wasn't sure. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn back, to lock myself in my house and wait for morning. But I thought of Jenny, lost somewhere in these woods, and steeled my resolve. "We have to do this," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "For Jenny." Mark nodded, and together we stepped into the mist-shrouded forest. The woods were eerily silent as we made our way deeper into their depths. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The whispers started almost immediately, a constant susurration that made it hard to concentrate. We had been walking for what felt like hours when Mark suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I listened intently. At first I heard nothing but the ever-present whispers. Then faintly I caught the sound of singing. It was a haunting melody, beautiful but somehow wrong, as if the notes were in a scale not meant for human ears. "It's coming from over there," Mark said, pointing to a faint glow visible through the trees. As we approached, the singing grew louder. We emerged into a small clearing and froze at the sight before us. Jenny was there, along with several other people I recognized from town. They were dancing in a circle around a strange, shimmering portal that hung in the air. The portal pulsed with an unearthly light, and through it I could see glimpses of a landscape that defied description. But it was the figure standing next to the portal that truly chilled me to the bone. It was tall, at least 8 feet, with a body that seemed to be made of living shadow. Its head was adorned with antlers that branched and twisted impossibly, and its eyes glowed with an eldritch light. "Jenny!" Mark called out, starting forward. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Wait!" I hissed. "Look at their eyes!" Jenny and the others turned at the sound of Mark's voice. Their eyes were blank, pupilless orbs that glowed with the same light as the portal. The shadowy figure turned its attention to us, and I felt the weight of its gaze like a physical force. When it spoke, its voice was like the whispers in the woods given form. "Ah, more have come to join us," it said, the words slithering into my mind. "Welcome, children of Oakwood Grove. We've been waiting for you." I clutched the amulet Mrs. Henderson had given me, feeling it grow warm against my skin. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What have you done to them?" The creature's mouth stretched into what might have been a smile. "I am older than your kind has words for," it said. "I am the one your ancestors sought to contact, the power they hoped to harness. And now, after centuries of waiting, the veil is finally thin enough for me to come through." "Let them go," Mark said, his voice cracking with fear and anger. The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Let them go? But they came willingly. The whispers called and they answered, just as you have." I realized with horror that it was right. We had come into the woods of our own free will, drawn by the whispers and our own curiosity, just like Jenny and the others. But the amulet was still warm against my skin, and I remembered Mrs. Henderson's words. It offered protection against the entities beyond the veil. Taking a deep breath, I held up the amulet. "By the power of those who came before," I said, the words coming to me as if from some deep ancestral memory, "I command you to release them and return to your own realm." The creature recoiled, hissing in pain or anger. The amulet flared with light, and for a moment I thought it had worked. But then the creature began to laugh again. "Brave but futile," it said. "The old magics are weak now, diluted by time and disbelief. You cannot stop what has already begun." As if on cue, the portal began to expand, tendrils of otherworldly energy reaching out into our world. Jenny and the others began to walk towards it, their movements jerky and unnatural. I knew we had to act fast. The fate of not just Jenny and the others, but possibly the entire town, maybe even the world, hung in the balance. But what could we do against a being of such power? As I stood there, frozen in indecision, I felt a change in the air. The whispers in the woods, which had been a constant presence, suddenly ceased. In the silence that followed, I heard a new sound, the beating of drums and the chanting of voices in a language I didn't recognize. The creature's head snapped up, its glowing eyes widening in what looked like fear. "No!" it hissed. "It cannot be!" From the trees around the clearing emerged a group of people dressed in traditional Native American attire. They moved with purpose, forming a circle around us and the creature. At their head was an elderly man whose eyes shone with wisdom and power. "You have trespassed long enough, Shadow Walker," the old man said, his voice ringing with authority. "It is time for you to return to your realm." The creature snarled, lashing out with tendrils of darkness. But the newcomers stood firm, their chanting growing louder. I felt the amulet grow hot again, pulsing in time with their chants. Suddenly I understood. These were the descendants of the Nawat, the original guardians of this place. They had returned to set things right. The old man turned to me, his eyes locking with mine. "The amulet," he said. "Use it now. Speak the words your heart knows to be true." And in that moment, I did know. The knowledge flowed through me, as if the spirits of all those who had protected this land were speaking through me. I held up the amulet, its light blazing like a star. "By earth and air, by fire and water," I intoned, my voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. "By all that is and all that will be, I seal this breach. Return, Shadow Walker, to the realm beyond. The veil is restored, and you have no power here." The amulet's light expanded, enveloping the clearing. The portal began to shrink, the creature howling in rage as it was pulled back through. Jenny and the others collapsed to the ground, the unearthly glow fading from their eyes. As the light faded, I found myself on my knees, exhausted but exhilarated. Mark was helping Jenny to her feet, tears of relief streaming down his face. The Nahuatl descendants moved among the townspeople, checking on them and offering words of comfort. The old man approached me, a smile crinkling his weathered face. "You have done well," he said, helping me to my feet. "The balance has been restored for now." "For now?" I asked, suddenly afraid. "You mean it could happen again?" He nodded gravely. "The veil will always be thin here. It will need guardians always. Are you willing to take on that responsibility?" I looked around at the clearing, at Jenny and the others who were slowly coming back to themselves, at Mark who was watching me with a mixture of awe and gratitude. I thought of Oakwood Grove, of the secrets it held, and the dangers it faced. "Yes," I said, feeling the weight of the decision even as I made it. "I'll do it. I'll be a guardian." The old man smiled, clasping my hand. "Then let us begin your training. There is much to learn, and the whispers in the woods never truly fall silent." As we made our way out of the forest, the first light of dawn was breaking over Oakwood Grove. The mist was dissipating, and for the first time since I'd arrived, the air felt clear and clean. I knew that life would never be the same. The veil had been lifted, and I had seen what lay beyond. But I also knew that I was no longer alone. With the wisdom of the Nahuatl and the strength of the town behind me, I was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The whispers in the woods might never truly be silenced, but now, at last, I knew how to listen and how to answer. In the years that followed, Oakwood Grove changed. The secrets that had been buried for so long came to light, and the town began to heal from centuries of fear and mistrust. I continued my work as a teacher, but now with an added responsibility. Under the tutelage of the Nahuatl elders, I learned the old ways of guarding the veil. Mark and Jenny, forever changed by their experiences, joined me in this sacred duty. Mrs. Henderson passed away peacefully a year after the incident in the woods, but not before sharing all she knew about the town's true history. The hidden book from the library was made public, and the town's dark past became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the importance of respecting the balance between worlds. The whispers in the woods never completely went away, but they no longer held the power to terrify. Instead, they became a reminder of the thin line we walk between realities and the importance of remaining vigilant. Oakwood Grove became known as a place of healing and wisdom. People came from far and wide to learn from the Nahuatl and to feel the unique energy of the forest. The town flourished, no longer haunted by its past, but embracing its role as a guardian of ancient secrets. As for me, I found a peace I never knew I was missing. In accepting my role as a guardian, I discovered a connection to the world around me that went deeper than I ever imagined possible. The woods that once terrified me became a second home, a place of power and wonder. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full and the mist rises from the valley, I still hear the whispers, but now I understand them. They are not a threat, but a reminder of the delicate balance we must maintain, the ancient pact between our world and the realms beyond. And so, life goes on in Oakwood Grove. We remain ever watchful, ever ready to defend the veil. For in this small town nestled in the mountains, the ordinary and the extraordinary walk hand in hand, and the whispers in the woods tell stories of worlds beyond our own, waiting just beyond the veil. Summer. I was 24. I snagged a gig as a ranger in Red Lodge State Park out in Minnesota. A small-timer from New York, I figured the quiet woods would be a nice change of pace. Plus, my buddy Vance had done the same thing a few years back, and he said the scenery wasn't half bad. He also said the job was a whole lot of nothing, which sounded even better coming from him. I was assigned the south stretch, a good 30 miles of trails, picnic areas, the whole deal. I'm not gonna lie, during my first few weeks Vance had it spot on. I spent most of my days driving around, tidying up campsites and waving at the occasional hiker. It was so peaceful, almost dull. Maybe that's why when things went sideways, it took me by complete surprise. It started with some missing person reports. Nothing unusual, folks wander off all the time. Still, protocol is protocol. So I made my rounds, chatting up campers about any strangers they might have seen. That's how I met Eleanor, a spry old gal with an airstream and a suspicious demeanor. We got to talking, and she mentioned hearing strange noises at night. Not an animal, I know them calls, she'd said, squinting up those trails. Something bigger. Honestly, I chalked it up to her imagination, but I made a note to be more watchful around those parts of the park. A few days later, the radio crackles to life. It's HQ. Another hiker's vanished. They want me to do a sweep, focus on the south end where Eleanor had mentioned the sounds. Suddenly, that dullness doesn't feel so comforting anymore. I roll up to the designated starting point, radio at my hip, and set out on foot. The sun's starting to dip, making the woods look all shadowy and unsettling. I keep expecting to find a lost kid or a grumpy retiree, but all the trails turn up empty. Eleanor's noises play in my head, making every rustle of leaves sound monstrous. Man, Vance never mentioned being this easy to spook. The further in I get, the colder it feels, and not just cause the lights fading. It's like the air itself sits heavier here. Then I see it. A flash of movement deeper in the trees. "Hello, anyone there?" I call out. No one answers. My heart drums a rhythm on my ribs. I don't like the looks of this. I unclip the radio. "HQ, this is Ranger Callahan. Possible sign of the missing hiker." Before I can finish my report, the thing steps out into the dusky light. Lord, I wish I could unsee it. It's tall, at least 7 feet, with wiry limbs that look too long. All twisted. Its head, that's the worst. Bulbous, skin pulled tight like something rotting neath. No eyes. Only slits for a nose and a gash of a mouth that hangs wide open. It lets out a screech that pierces my ears, a sound I can't even describe. Fear shoots white-hot through my veins. Whatever this is, it ain't natural. I fumble for my sidearm, fingers trembling as I line up a shot. HQ. Shots fired. Shots fired at the creature lunges, and it's fast, inhumanly fast. The gun flies out of my hand as I hit the ground, rolling to avoid a swipe of its impossibly long claws. My heart hammers like it's about to leap out of my chest. I scramble back, trying to put space between us, the forest blurring around me. I need to radio for help, but where's the damn thing? I whip my head around, searching the trees frantically. It could be anywhere, and there, slinking across the branches like a warped spider. It screeches again, a sound that cuts right through me and leaps. Time slows. My mouth opens to scream, but all that comes out is a choked gasp as the weight of the creature crashes into my chest. My arm slams into a tree trunk hard enough to make my teeth rattle. It's a half-blind stumble from there, the adrenaline masking the flare of pain in my shoulder. I can hear that awful screech echoing behind me, getting closer. Branches whip at my face as I run, tearing at my clothes, my skin. Doesn't matter. Pain's temporary. Getting eaten ain't. Lungs screaming, I burst out into a clearing and skid to a halt. There's an old fire tower in the center. Rusty and skeletal, but it's high. If I can climb it, maybe I can get a signal on the radio. Call for backup. It's my only shot. I sprint towards it. The metal ladder rungs cold beneath my battered hands. Scrambling up feels slow, clumsy with terror clawing in my throat. Don't look down, don't look down, I chanted in my head, but I do. The creatures below, circling the base of the tower, those spindly limbs twitching as it regards me with that empty-eyed stare. Nearly at the top, I risk another glance. Through the trees I can see my patrol truck. Just a little speck, the radio, if I could just get to it. I'm almost there, my fingers desperately grasping the last rung when the tower gives a sickening lurch. One of the rusted support beams groans, then snaps with a horrible metallic shriek. The whole thing tilts, slow at first, and then with terrifying speed. My scream gets cut short as the ground rushes up toward me. Pain explodes in my leg and blackness swallows me whole. I wake up in the hospital groggy and confused. A nurse tells me some hikers stumbled across me, unconscious but lucky to be alive. Broken leg, mild concussion, a hell of a story, she says. But when I try to explain what happened, the words stick in my throat. It sounds too wild even to me. The other park rangers give me sympathetic looks, say I must have been in shock. Maybe they're right. That part's sadly unsurprising. But what I saw out there, I've worked forests my whole life, seen all manner of critters. That thing wasn't any bear or bobcat I've ever heard of. Eleanor, bless her nosy soul, comes to visit, brings me a pie and a whole lot of I told you so energy. Turns out she had a run-in with the creature too, right around the time she'd reported those noises. It snatched one of her chickens and vanished back into the trees. We never saw it again. The reports of missing folks stopped too. Whatever it was seems it moved on or found its fill. The park never officially reopened that trail. Unsafe conditions, the signs say. Fine by me. Vance called when he heard what happened, joked about me finally getting some excitement. I didn't find it so funny. They offered my old job back, of course. Said they needed experienced people after the whole incident. I turned it down, told them I'd taken a shine to the quiet indoors. They looked at me like I was nuts considering. Sometimes late at night, I still think I hear that screech, high and wrong, like a nail dragged across glass. The doctors blamed it on tinnitus, some nerve damage from the fall. Maybe they're right, but I started calling it the rake back because of the way it looked all twisted and hunched. It seems as good a name as any for a monster you can't prove exists. My name is Andrew Thunderbird, 35 years old, and this story is from a year that feels like a lifetime ago. I was born and raised in the small town of Wellesley, Massachusetts. Not much happens here, which is why what I'm about to tell you is even more bizarre. It started innocuously enough. I was fresh out of college, back in my hometown, working a dead-end job at the local hardware store. Not exactly the life I'd envisioned, but hey, it paid the bills. My girlfriend Lacey had just moved in with me. We were both trying to save up for something better, but at least we had each other. One evening, my buddy Owen called. "Bryce, you up for a camping trip this weekend?" Just the guys like old times. Owen always had a knack for pulling me out of my funk. "Sure, why not?" I replied. I figured a weekend in the woods might clear my head. Friday rolled around and we packed up Owen's beat-up truck with all the essentials. Tents, sleeping bags, food, and a decent stash of beer. It was me, Owen, Kyle, and Benny. We headed out to a spot in the Berkshires, a place we'd camped a few times before. It was quiet and far from the hassles of daily life. We got there just before dusk, set up camp and lit a fire. The night was filled with laughter and stories. It was like we were kids again, with no responsibilities, no worries. Around midnight, I decided to hit the sack. The others were still up, talking and joking. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, I heard I could hear their voices fading into the background, mingling with the sounds of the forest. I woke up to silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. I checked my watch, 3 a.m. I sat up and noticed that Owen, Kyle, and Benny were all fast asleep. I stepped out of the tent to stretch my legs and take a leak. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the campsite. As I stood there, I heard a rustling noise in the trees. Probably a deer or some other animal, I thought. But then I saw it, a shadowy figure moving among the trees. It was tall, hunched over, and moving with an unsettling grace. My first thought was that it was a bear, but something about its shape was all wrong. I called out, my voice breaking the silence. The figure stopped, turned towards me, and then vanished into the darkness. My heart was racing, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I finished up and went back to the tent, though sleep didn't come easy. The next morning I told the guys about what I'd seen. Owen laughed it off. "You probably had one too many beers. Nothing out here but us and the wildlife." The others agreed, and we went about our day hiking and exploring the area. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, things took a turn for the worse. We were sitting around the fire again, talking about old times, when we heard a blood-curdling scream. It sounded like a woman, but there was something primal about it, something that chilled me to the bone. "What the hell was that?" Kyle asked, his face pale. Benny, always the joker, tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's Bigfoot, or worse, Kyle's ex-girlfriend." We laughed nervously, but the tension was palpable. We decided to check it out, grabbing flashlights and heading in the direction of the scream. The woods were dense, and the beams of our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness. After about 10 minutes, we came across a small clearing. In the middle of it was a deer, or what was left of one. It had been torn apart, its insides strewn across the grass. "Oh my God," Benny whispered. "What could have done this? Mountain lion, maybe?" Owen suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. We heard another rustle in the trees, and all our flashlights swung towards the sound. The figure was back, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was taller than I'd realized, easily 7 feet, with long, matted hair and glowing eyes that reflected the light from our flashlights. The creature let out a low, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. We didn't stop until we were back at the fire, panting and wide-eyed. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to catch my breath. "Agreed," Owen said. "Let's pack up and leave, now." We scrambled to gather our things, tossing them haphazardly into the truck. The forest around us seemed to close in, the shadows growing deeper and more oppressive. Just as we were about to get in the truck, Benny screamed. We turned to see the creature standing at the edge of the campsite, its eyes locked onto us. Without thinking, I grabbed the hatchet from my pack and hurled it at the creature. It let out a roar and retreated into the woods, and Owen didn't need to be told twice. We sped down the dirt road, the truck bouncing over the rough terrain. The moonlight flickered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the windshield. We drove for what felt like hours until we reached a small town. We found a diner that was still open and stumbled inside, disheveled and shaken. The waitress, an older woman with a kind face, looked at us with concern. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," she said, pouring us coffee. "Something like that," I muttered. We told her a sanitized version of what had happened, just enough to explain why we were so rattled. She listened, nodding occasionally. "You know, there are old legends about these woods," she said. "Stories of creatures that aren't quite human. Most folks dismiss them as just that, stories. But you never know. We spent the rest of the night in a cheap motel, too afraid to sleep. The next morning, we drove back to Wellesley in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We never spoke about that night again. Not really. It was like an unspoken pact, a way to keep the fear at bay. Lacey noticed a change in me right away. "Bryce, what happened out there?" she asked one night as we lay in bed. "Nothing," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a weird trip. I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. None of us were. Owen moved to another state a few months later, saying he needed a fresh start. Kyle and Benny drifted away, their laughter and jokes now tinged with an edge of unease. As for me, I stayed in Wellesley, but I never went camping again. I sold my gear, got a new job, and tried to put that night behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that scream, and I wonder what it was that we saw out there in the woods. Life went on as it does, but the shadows of that night never entirely left me. I married Lacey, and we had 2 kids. I took up woodworking, finding solace in the rhythm of carving and shaping. The routine helped, but the memory lingered. One evening, years later, I was working in my garage when Owen called out of the blue. "Bryce, we need to talk." We met at a bar halfway between our towns, the kind of place where no one asked questions, more worn than I remembered. We ordered beers and sat in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. "I can't stop thinking about it," Owen finally said. "That night. I've tried to move on, but it's always there, like a shadow." I nodded. "Same here. What do you think it was?" Owen took a deep breath. "I don't know. But I've been doing some research. There are stories, old legends about creatures in those woods. They say it's something ancient, something that preys on people who wander too far." I shivered, remembering the creature's eyes. "So what do we do?" Owen shrugged. "I don't think there's anything we can do. Just live our lives, I guess." But I had to talk to someone who understands. We stayed there for hours, talking about everything and nothing, trying to make sense of the senseless. It didn't bring closure, but it helped to know I wasn't alone in my fear. As the years passed, the memory of that night faded but never disappeared. I grew old, watching my children grow up and start families of their own. I told them stories about my youth, but I never mentioned that night in the britches. Then one evening my son Max, now a grown man with a family of his own, came to visit. We sat on the porch watching the sunset, and he turned to me with a serious expression. "Dad, do you remember that camping trip you went on years ago? The one you never talk about?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "Yeah, I remember." Max nodded. "I've been doing some research. There are stories about those woods, stories that go back centuries. People talk about seeing things, hearing screams. I think you saw something real, something that shouldn't be there." I looked at him, my heart heavy with the weight of old fears. "Maybe. But there's no point in dwelling on it. We survived, and that's what matters." Max nodded, but I could see the curiosity and determination in his eyes. "I just wanted you to know that I believe you, Dad. Whatever it was, you're not alone." As the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard, I felt a sense of peace for the first time in years. Maybe the past would never fully let go, but I had my family, and that was enough. Life is full of mysteries, some better left unexplored. I don't have all the answers, and maybe I never will. But I've learned to live with the shadows, to find light in the moments that matter, and that's enough for me.